There was a night in late June when a 16-year-old boy stood at the top of the Astronomy Tower with a wand aimed at the most powerful wizard in the world, and he could not pull it off. The castle below him was in chaos. Death Eaters had broken through wards that had kept Hogwarts protected for years. The Dark Lord's followers were moving through corridors that had never seen that kind of shadow. The night sky over the Scottish Highlands was clear and still, and the stars were out, and the wind off the mountains carried the smell of old stone and late spring and the cold dark of the loch far below. Inside all of that quiet beauty, Draco Malfoy had arrived at the moment he had spent an entire school year building toward. He had sacrificed his sleep for it. He had given up his health and his color, and the particular ease that had always characterized him in the school's social landscape. The ease of a boy who had grown up being told he mattered, and who had never had reason to doubt it. He had exchanged that ease for 9 months of solitary, obsessive work in the room of requirement, testing and adjusting, sending birds through a broken cabinet and checking what returned on the other side, adjusting again, sending more birds. He had done this in the early hours before the castle stirred, and in the late hours, when the corridors were empty, and on weekends, when he should have been sleeping, and at meals, when he should have been eating. He had worked on a plan that had been given to him as a punishment rather than a privilege, assigned to him because he was the most effective thing Voldemort could threaten his father with, because the Malfoy family's greatest vulnerability had always been the love between its members, and Draco's life, placed in an impossible position, was the cleanest available expression of what it cost Lucius to have failed. And now he was here. He had disarmed Albus Dumbledore, who had not resisted, who had leaned against the stone parapet of the tower, as though he had been expecting this moment, and had made his own arrangements for it. Draco had both wands, Dumbledore's and his own. His own wand was raised, the target was before him. All of the preparation, all of the months, all of the cost, had produced this single point in time. He could not do it. The wand shook in his hand. His face was white and wet, and the sounds that came from him were not the sounds of someone gathering themselves to do something difficult. They were the sounds of someone who had understood, in the seconds between raising the wand and the moment when firing it would have been required, that they were not going to fire, that they had never been going to fire, that the gap between what the situation required of them and what they were actually capable of was a gap that 9 months of work had not narrowed by a single inch. Albus Dumbledore, who was dying already from the cumulative costs of his own war, looked at Draco without fear. He said 5 words that Draco would carry for the rest of his life. He said that Draco was not a killer. He said it with the certainty of someone who had been paying attention for a long time, who had access to a version of the truth about Draco that Draco had not been able to see clearly from inside his own position. He said it the way you say something that is simply a fact, the same way you would state the color of the sky. Draco did not argue. He began to cry. This is the story of why no one who had been watching carefully could have been surprised by that moment. The signs were there from the beginning, from the first year at Hogwarts, in dozens of small moments that most observers missed or misread. A consistent pattern was writing itself into the record of Draco Malfoy's school life. The pattern said, "This person is performing something he does not have. The performance is skilled and consistent and convincing, and it will fail when circumstances require something the performance cannot provide." Those circumstances arrived on the Astronomy Tower in June of his 6th year, but the arrival had been telegraphed for 7 years before it. Before we settle into the longer story tonight, if you are finding comfort in this narration, please take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so new videos reach you when they arrive. A like helps the channel more than you might expect, and the playlist holds more stories whenever sleep takes time to arrive. Now, back to the beginning, and the family that shaped Draco before Hogwarts was ever part of the picture. The Malfoys had been prominent in British wizarding society for centuries. The name carried a specific history. In French, from which the family's Norman ancestry derived, it meant something close to bad faith. Whether the family had grown into its name over time, or had chosen it precisely for what it communicated, is a question no one has definitively settled. But the name and the family had become inseparable across several hundred years of wizarding history. What the Malfoys were known for, across those centuries, was survival. They survived periods that destroyed other families, exposure scares during times when non-magical people were suspicious of magic, and dangerous in their suspicion. The rise and fall of dark wizards over many generations, wars and alignments that had taken the Bones family and the McKinnons and others whose commitment to causes outweighed their commitment to themselves. The Malfoys had navigated all of it and had emerged from each period with their wealth and their standing and their basic social position largely intact. This was not because they were brave, it was because they were careful. They gave money to the right causes. They maintained the right alliances. They cultivated the kind of institutional relationships on school boards and in ministry offices and at charitable organizations that could be called on when calling on them was necessary. They understood, across the generations, how to hold values in public and how to hold them in private, and how to make both postures convincing. They understood how to position themselves in relation to whoever held power without fully committing to that position in ways that would be difficult to explain away if the power changed hands. They were a family of calculations, and the calculations had been running long enough that they had become something that looked like instinct. Lucius Malfoy had served Voldemort during the First Wizarding War. This was not a peripheral involvement. He bore the dark mark on his left forearm, the tattoo that Voldemort used to summon his followers, and that burned when the Dark Lord called. He attended the gatherings of the Death Eaters. He was present at meetings where strategy was decided and targets were identified. He carried out tasks whose nature was never fully specified in any account that has come down from that period, but whose context suggests they were not administrative. The Ministry of Magic, in the aftermath of the war, examined his record carefully. When Voldemort fell in October of 1981, Lucius appeared before the ministry and offered his explanation. He had been acting under the Imperious Curse, he said. He had not freely chosen to serve Voldemort. The curse had removed his capacity to refuse. He was a victim who had been compelled to do things he would never have done without magical coercion. He expressed appropriate remorse. He cooperated with the investigation in the limited way that served his interests. He had the right legal representation and the right financial resources behind him, and the right relationships with the right people at the ministry who had been cultivated for exactly these kinds of moments. He was believed, or believed enough. He walked free. He went home to Malfoy Manor and resumed his life, took back his seat on the Hogwarts school board, resumed his donations to wizarding charities, appeared at ministry functions with appropriate expressions of relief that the worst was over. He rebuilt the surface of the life that had been interrupted by the First War, and beneath the surface, he held whatever he held about what he had done and why, and kept it there. Draco was born on the 5th of June 1980, which meant he arrived into a household that had, within the past 9 months, successfully managed the transition from a Death Eater's family to a family that had been tragically coerced by magical means. The demonstration this provided, before Draco could walk or speak, was the demonstration of a family that knew how to negotiate between what it believed and what it claimed to believe. The Malfoy household was one where the gap between those two things was understood by everyone and discussed by no one. What Draco absorbed from this, before he could have named it, was a way of relating to ideology. Ideology in the Malfoy household was something you performed when performing it was advantageous and adjusted when the performance became a liability. It was a social tool with its own applications and its own limits, not a principle that demanded action regardless of cost. Conviction, the kind of conviction that held when everything else failed, was for people who had less to protect than the Malfoys did. This distinction was never named. It was simply present in the atmosphere of the place. Malfoy Manor stood in Wiltshire, behind iron gates that the family kept closed to everyone not specifically invited. The building was large and severe, built from pale stone that took on different qualities in different lights, cold and grey in winter, almost warm in long summer evenings. The grounds were maintained by staff employed for that purpose. The interior held rooms that had been furnished across several centuries, portraits in heavy frames stretching back through generations of blonde-haired, pale-featured Malfoys, tables and chairs built from dark wood, cabinets containing objects the family did not discuss outside the hearing of trusted individuals. The books on the shelves were not the books most wizarding families kept. Some of them had restricted markings on their spines. Some of them were kept behind glass. Draco grew up around them before he could read them, in the way that children grow up around the things their families consider normal and absorb the normalcy of those things, regardless of what outside observers might make of them. House elves attended to the domestic life of the manor. Dobby, who would become one of the most consequential figures in Harry Potter's story, served the family throughout Draco's childhood. He was treated with the indifference of a family that had owned servants for long enough that the servants' inner lives had ceased to register as requiring any consideration. The fear Dobby lived in, the punishments, the complete absence of anything resembling a life outside the family's service, were simply the conditions of the arrangement. Draco grew up in a house where creatures capable of genuine love and loyalty were treated as objects, and this was how things were. Narcissa Malfoy had been born a Black. The Black family was, if anything, more extreme in its pure blood ideology than the Malfoys. The Blacks tracked their bloodline on a woven family record that hung in their London townhouse, and names that had been burned off it were visible as scorch marks in the cloth, the places where family members had made choices the family could not tolerate. Andromeda Black had been burned off it when she married Ted Tonks. The family had treated her erasure as both necessary and complete. Narcissa had 3 sisters. The most consequential for understanding Draco was Bellatrix, who had married Rodolphus Lestrange, and who had become, across the years of the First Wizarding War and the imprisonment in Azkaban that followed, the most devoted of all Voldemort's followers. Bellatrix's commitment to the Dark Lord was not the pragmatic alignment of someone who understood which way power was moving and positioned themselves accordingly. It was total and self-consuming in a way that put it beyond the register of ordinary political conviction. She had gone to Azkaban and spent years there, in the presence of Dementors whose effect on the human psyche was systematic and severe, and she had come out more committed, not less. Her faith in the cause had not been weakened by suffering, it had been cemented by it. Narcissa was not Bellatrix. This is perhaps the single most important fact about Narcissa Malfoy, and it is the fact that tells you the most about what Draco actually was. Narcissa shared the beliefs of her family, or had been raised to share them. She absorbed the language of blood purity, and the hierarchy it organized, and the disdain it directed at those it placed below. She held these things as part of herself, but she had never surrendered herself to those things the way Bellatrix had. There was always something held back, something that measured the cost of conviction against the value of what was being asked, and found that some things mattered more. The thing that mattered more was Draco. Narcissa's love for her son was total and unconditional, in the specific way that Bellatrix's love for the cause was total and unconditional. Both women gave themselves over to something completely. What they gave themselves over to was different. Bellatrix gave herself to an ideology that placed herself above others. Narcissa gave herself to a person who had not chosen to be born to her and who had not yet demonstrated whether he deserved it. The difference between those two forms of total commitment produced very different outcomes when the war put both of them to the test. Draco absorbed this before he could name it. He lived inside a household where love, in the form his mother expressed it, was the realest and most consistent thing available to him. He watched his father navigate the world with calculation. He watched his mother make decisions that, when looked at from a distance, were always organized around the same central point. He could not have articulated this when he was small, but it shaped him at the level that things shape people who grow up inside them, completely and invisibly, so that the shaping is present in everything they do, long before they have language for what was doing the shaping. What Draco believed, at the level of received certainty, when he arrived at Hogwarts at 11, was that he was better than most people. The category of most people included Muggle-born witches and wizards, Muggles themselves, and any wizarding family that had made the kinds of choices the Malfoys and the Blacks considered betrayals. He believed this not because he had reasoned his way to it, but because he had absorbed it from the atmosphere of the house he grew up in, the same way he had absorbed the belief that house elves were property, and that certain books were interesting, and that his family's name was a token of significance in the world. What he did not have, and this is the sign that everything else builds on, was any encounter with what that belief actually required. Ideology absorbed without experience of its consequences exists in a person as inherited feeling rather than tested conviction, and Draco had never been in any situation that required him to act on his beliefs in a way that would cost him something real, something that went beyond social performance, something that required the belief to remain intact. under conditions that would have strained or dissolved it if it were not genuinely held. Those conditions were coming. But first there was Diagon Alley, and the train, and the beginning of school. The first meeting with Harry Potter happened in Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, while both of them were being fitted for school robes. Neither of them knew who the other was. Draco talked. He talked the way he had learned to talk in the drawing rooms of Malfoy Manor, filling silences with observations and opinions, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been told that the world might not share his opinions. He mentioned Quidditch. He mentioned his father was going to buy him his own broomstick for Hogwarts, though first years were not supposed to have them, because his father had ways of arranging such things. He said that he expected to be sorted into Slytherin, because all of his family had been there. He said that Muggle-born students probably should not be allowed at Hogwarts. He mentioned curiosity about Harry Potter, whose name he already knew from the way wizarding children knew it. None of this was a manifesto. It was a recitation, the contents of his world poured out in the casual way children pour out their worlds when they are in unfamiliar situations and want to fill silence. He was performing what he had been made, in a context where he assumed the performance would be received as ordinary. The second meeting, on the Hogwarts Express, produced the first real sign. By then, Draco knew who the boy from the robe shop was. He came to Harry's compartment with deliberateness, with Crabbe and Goyle behind him. He gave his full name with the emphasis that made it a presentation, as though the name itself were the meaningful thing, and the person holding it were almost secondary. He extended his hand. Harry did not take it. The refusal was not ideological. Harry had not reasoned through the Malfoy family's Death Eater history. He refused because Ron Weasley, sitting in the same compartment, and with his own family's relationship to the Malfoys, had given the impression that Draco was someone not to associate with. Harry was 11, and he made the decision quickly and without ceremony. For Draco, who had never been refused by anyone whose opinion was required to matter, this was something new. Not the refusal itself exactly. The social situation of being refused, publicly, by someone his own age, in front of Crabbe and Goyle and Ron Weasley. The Malfoy name had been offered, and the Malfoy name had been declined. He was 11 years old, and this was his first day on the Hogwarts Express, and the thing he had been told all his life was his most important social asset, had not produced the effect it was supposed to produce. What developed from this was not ideological enmity, though it borrowed the language and the forms of ideological enmity. What developed was wounded pride. The distinction between those two things matters, because they produce superficially similar behaviors and very different underlying realities. Wounded pride wants to win. It wants the person who dismissed it to feel the dismissal returned. It wants to demonstrate its own worth in terms the person who dismissed it cannot ignore. Wounded pride does not actually want to harm anyone. It wants to come out ahead. Genuine political conviction, the kind that would make someone an actual Death Eater, wants something completely different. The rivalry between Draco and Harry across 7 years at Hogwarts was always the expression of wounded pride, wearing the costume of political conviction. Every sneer, every use of his father's name as a threat, every attempt to get Harry in trouble through school authority, every badge campaign and taunting exchange in corridors, was operating on the logic of a social contest that had been running since a rejected handshake on a train. Draco wanted to win. The ideology was real in the sense that he had absorbed it, but he deployed it primarily as ammunition in a contest that was, at its core, about something much more personal. He was sorted into Slytherin before the sorting hat had been on his head long enough to deliberate. The hat found a child whose entire psychological world pointed in one direction. His connection to the house was layered. Family tradition, absorbed ideology, the social expectations of everyone around him. Of course he went to Slytherin. The question was never whether. The question was what Slytherin would do to him and what he would do with it. What Slytherin gave him was not the peer environment his family had perhaps imagined. The common room had its own social dynamics that did not automatically accord him the top position. Other students came from families with their own claims to importance. There were students in Slytherin who matched or exceeded the Malfoys in the specific currencies the house valued. He settled toward the top of the hierarchy, but had to maintain his position through the ordinary tools of school social life, reputation, the cultivation of useful associations, and the particular social aggression of someone who has learned that making others smaller is one way of appearing larger. In this environment, Crabbe and Goyle were not companions in any genuine sense. They were reliable followers, which suited the arrangement his family had established and his own understanding of what people at his side were for. They backed him up. They provided presence. They absorbed whatever he directed at them without complaint. They were constant in a way that Draco, who had not grown up with genuine friendship, found necessary and depended on. The first evidence that Draco was not what he was performing came before his first year was half over. The Forbidden Forest incident, which occurred in his first year as a result of the Norbert situation, is often reduced to a single data point. Draco was a coward. The truth is more specific and more interesting than that. The Norbert incident began with Harry and Hermione and Ron successfully getting Hagrid's illegal dragon away from the school under cover of darkness, aided by Ron's brother Charlie and his friends. Draco had found out about the dragon and had gone to McGonagall to report it, which resulted in Harry and Hermione and Draco himself all receiving detention. The punishment was a night expedition into the Forbidden Forest with Hagrid to investigate a trail of silver unicorn blood and find out what had been killing the animals. The punishment was genuinely unpleasant by design. The forest was large and old and housed things that the school's protective rules acknowledged were dangerous, which was why the school prohibited students from entering it. Going in at night, in small groups, following a blood trail through dark trees, was not a comfortable assignment. Draco had been performing toughness and superiority for months by this point. He had delivered his opinions about who deserved to attend Hogwarts and what the school's sorting system ought to be, and what the Malfoy family's position in the wizarding world signified. He had sneered at Harry and Ron and Neville Longbottom and Hermione, with the practiced ease of someone who had absorbed his material early, and who had found that the delivery of it produced consistent results. None of that performance had required him to do anything that carried personal risk. In the forest, Hagrid split the group. Draco ended up walking with Harry. They followed the trail through the trees, moving toward a clearing that the blood suggested was the site of the most recent attack. The trees closed overhead. The sounds of the other group faded. In the dark, with only the light of the lantern Draco carried, the forest did not feel like a school disciplinary setting. It felt like a forest at night where something had recently been killed. They found the unicorn. It was dead, lying in the clearing, and the blood around it was silver and still bright in the lantern light. Then they saw what was feeding on it, a cloaked figure, moving along the ground in a way that was wrong, in a way that communicated that whatever moved like that had not arrived at that way of moving through ordinary biological means. It moved toward them through the silver-lit clearing. Draco Malfoy screamed, not a startled sound, not a controlled expression of fear, a scream, the full-bodied kind that bypasses intention and decision and comes from somewhere that performance cannot reach. And then he ran. He crashed through the undergrowth in the direction they had come from, and he left Harry alone in the clearing, with the thing moving toward him, and he kept running until he was out of the trees. The centaur Firenze arrived and carried Harry away. Draco was found at the forest's edge, shaken, and he did not discuss what he had seen. Look at what that scene contained. It contained a boy who had been performing confidence and superiority with consistent success for months, and who, when confronted with something genuinely threatening that existed entirely outside the social register in which his performance had meaning, abandoned the performance and the person he had been paired with and ran. The darkness did not care who his father was. The cloaked figure moving through the clearing was not an entity against which dropping the Malfoy name had any application. There was no institutional authority to invoke, no borrowed power to call on, no social mechanism that could manage what was happening. The situation required something personal, some internal resource of steadiness or courage, and Draco's inventory did not contain it. He had been prepared, by everything his life had given him, for the performance of certain qualities. He had not been prepared for the actual possession of those qualities, under conditions that tested them. The two things look identical from the outside, until the test arrives, and the Forbidden Forest was the first test. He rebuilt the performance afterward. The armor of superiority went back on, and he continued his Hogwarts social life, and the incident was absorbed into the year and largely forgotten by the people who had not been standing in that clearing with him. But the clearing had shown something, briefly and unmistakably, and the something it had shown would repeat itself in various forms across the next 6 years. His second year began under the shadow of the Chamber of Secrets, though Draco did not know it was a shadow, or what had cast it. The diary his father had placed in Ginny Weasley's cauldron in Flourish and Blots was doing what Tom Riddle had designed it to do, slowly possessing the girl who had been given it, moving her toward the pipe beneath the sink in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, guiding her toward the act of opening the chamber. None of this was known to Draco. He had not been told. Lucius had not included his son in the information chain. What Draco had, in his second year, was the atmosphere of threat and the inherited ideology that organized it, which he performed with visible pleasure. Students were being petrified. Muggle-born students were the targets. The school was afraid. Draco, who had spent his first year learning how to use his family's beliefs as social ammunition, found that the Chamber's attacks created an environment in which those beliefs could be worn with a particular kind of satisfaction. He implied he had information that other people did not have. He hinted in corridors and common rooms that he knew things. He enjoyed the fear that the attacks created in the students he had been raised to believe were inferior. He positioned himself as someone in the know, connected to something powerful, on the right side of whatever authority was reaching down into the school and causing damage. The Polyjuice scene made this positioning embarrassing, though only in retrospect. Harry and Ron, disguised as Crabbe and Goyle, spent an evening in Draco's company in the Slytherin common room, specifically to find out what he knew about the chamber and the attacks. What they discovered was that he knew nothing. He had theories. He had the confident tone of someone who is performing knowledge. But the specific information, who was behind the attacks, what was in the chamber, how the mechanism worked, was entirely absent from his answers. He was speculating the way the rest of the school was speculating, and framing his speculation in the direction that made him look like someone with access to the real story. He was not. His father had acted, and the action had created an atmosphere that Draco was inhabiting as a performance, like someone standing at the edge of a fire they did not start, and claiming its warmth as though they had lit it. The mudblood slur, deployed at Quidditch practice, tells a similar story. He used the word in a playground argument about whether Hermione was allowed to be in the stands during a practice session. The argument was trivial. The word he chose was not trivial. It carried centuries of contempt and violence and exclusion, but Draco wielded it with the particular carelessness of someone who has been handed a weapon without being given its full history. He knew it would cause pain. He used it to win a social confrontation that did not require that level of weapon. He reached for the most effective instrument in his inherited arsenal and used it in a context that was functionally low stakes, because the instrument was there and he had been taught it was acceptable to use it. The dueling club, established in chaotic fashion by Gilderoy Lockhart, gave Draco a snake and a stage and a sequence of events he was unable to control. He conjured the serpent. He directed it toward Justin Finch Fletchley. Then Harry stepped forward and spoke in Parseltongue, the language of snakes, and the room reacted with fear because nobody else could understand what Harry was saying, and the sounds were frightening. The scene had reorganized itself around something Draco had not anticipated and could not direct. Snape ended it. Draco stood in the middle of something he had started and watched the scene play out without him. This was already a pattern. The third year provided the Buckbeak incident, which has been analyzed many times as evidence of Draco's cruelty, and cruelty is present. But the specific architecture of how the cruelty was expressed tells you more than the cruelty itself. Draco approached Buckbeak with the carelessness of someone who has been told rules do not apply to him. He ignored the specific protocols Hagrid had explained. He called the hippogriff a stupid creature, loud enough to be heard by the class. The animal responded the way an animal responds when someone disrespects it directly and on purpose. Buckbeak slashed Draco's arm. The wound was real and it hurt. Draco understood immediately what he had, an injury, in Hagrid's class, witnessed by many students. He told his father. Lucius moved through the ministry with his connections, and his money, and his habitual facility with official channels. Hearings were scheduled. Buckbeak was condemned. The matter moved through the bureaucratic structure of the Ministry of Magic to a conclusion that had Draco's wound at its origin, but Lucius's power as its engine. Draco wore the sling for weeks beyond medical necessity. The sling was visibility. Every student who saw him with his arm in the sling saw a reminder that something had happened to him, that he had been wronged, that the wrongness had not yet been fully resolved. He wore his injury around the school as evidence of grievance. and the evidence did its work in the corridors, while his father's machinations did their work in the offices of the ministry. He did not confront Hagrid directly. He did not attempt to address the situation through any personal action that would have required him to apply force in a context where the outcome was uncertain. He identified a mechanism, the adult authority his father represented, and used it. Then he waited. This is the architecture of Draco's cruelty throughout his first 3 years. Find a target, identify a weapon that does not require him to be personally at risk, deploy it from whatever distance the mechanism allows, then inhabit the position of wronged party while the damage is done by something other than himself. Words in corridors, his father's name, institutional authority, borrowed power. The cruelty was real, but it was always at a remove, always mediated, always requiring that someone or something else carry the actual force. He was also, in the same year, responsible for the Dementor stunt during a Quidditch match. He dressed himself and Crabbe and Goyle in Dementor costumes and flew beneath Harry during the match, attempting to cause Harry to relive the worst memories of his life and fall from his broom. The plan was creative in its identification of a real vulnerability and clever in its use of that vulnerability as a weapon. The plan also failed completely. Harry cast a Patronus and sent 3 costumed 13-year-olds into the mud, in the rain, in front of an audience. Draco landed badly. He was wet and dirty, and the failure was visible, and there was no sling to wear afterward that would reframe the loss as something else. The Dementor stunt was Draco's most revealing early performance, because it made explicit the characteristic shape of his approach. He could not use an actual Dementor. He could not access the thing that would have caused the harm he wanted to cause, so he simulated it. He built a costume and deployed the simulation and tried to produce the effect of the real thing through theatrical means. He did this from a distance, keeping himself insulated from the actual encounter while trying to capture its results. When the simulation met the real thing, which is what a Patronus is, the simulation lost. The world Draco was born into had its own logic and its own texture, and understanding both requires sitting with what the wizarding world actually looked like in the months immediately after Voldemort's fall in 1981. When the curse rebounded in Godric's Hollow and Voldemort's body was destroyed, the wizarding world responded with something that was not entirely unlike what happens in a country when a long and grinding occupation ends. Not relief, exactly, or not only relief, because relief implies a clean transition from bad to better, and what actually happened was messier than that. The Death Eaters scattered. Some were captured immediately. Some disappeared into the ordinary landscape of wizarding life, claiming they had never been Death Eaters, or had been coerced into whatever they had done. Some fled to places where the ministry's jurisdiction was uncertain. The process of sorting out who had done what was complicated by several things. The Imperious Curse was a real and documented fact of the First War. The Dark Lord had used it widely, and some of the people claiming coercion were telling the truth. The difficulty was that some of them were not, and distinguishing the genuinely coerced from the willingly complicit required a degree of certainty that the ministry's investigative processes could not always achieve. The Death Eater trials that followed Voldemort's fall were a mixture of genuine justice and convenient outcome depending on who was being tried and who was doing the trying. Lucius Malfoy's case resolved in his favor, not because the evidence exonerated him clearly, but because the combination of his story, his money, his connections, and the ministry's genuine uncertainty about some cases in that category produced an outcome that let him go home. He went home to Malfoy Manor, and he went home to Narcissa, and he went home to Draco, who was 18 months old, and he went home to a household that would now spend the next decade and a half presenting itself as a family that had survived a terrible period through no fault of its own. The presentation required maintenance. Every social gathering, every public statement, every school board meeting, every charitable donation, every appearance at ministry functions was part of the maintenance. Lucius became expert at the particular performance of someone who had suffered through the Dark Lord's rise and who was grateful that order had been restored. He held this performance with consistency and skill. It was not unlike the performance he had maintained during the First War, when it was advantageous to appear to be a powerful and connected figure in the Death Eater organization. He had always been a skilled performer, The content of what he was performing changed based on what was useful. Narcissa's version of the performance was different in quality. Lucius performed for external audiences. Narcissa performed for herself and for Draco, which is to say she maintained the household's internal world with the same care she brought to its external presentation. She ensured that Draco's world was stable and ordered, and that the values she wanted him to absorb were present in the texture of daily life. She chose what he read, and who he spent time with, and what was discussed at the dinner table, and how the house elves were referred to in conversation, and which portraits received attention, and which were passed without comment. She built a world for her son. The world she built had its own internal consistency. It was a world in which the Malfoy family occupied a position of importance, in which blood purity was a fact of nature rather than an ideology, in which certain things were simply true about who mattered and who did not, in ways that did not require justification. She built this world because it was the world she had grown up in, and because it was the world that made sense to her, and because she believed, without having examined the belief particularly carefully, that this was the appropriate inheritance for the son she was raising. She also built it with love. The world she built for Draco was not a cold one. It was organized around a center of warmth that was specifically directed at him. He was loved in the Malfoy household in a way that was concrete and consistent and present in every interaction Narcissa had with him across his childhood. Whatever else the household contained, whatever other currents ran through it, there was this. A mother who loved her son with a completeness that organized everything around him. Draco absorbed both things simultaneously, and simultaneously could not separate them. The ideology and the love were delivered together, from the same person, in the same rooms, in the same daily life. He could not examine one without the other, because they were not, for him, separate. The ideology was part of how love was expressed in his household. The love was part of what made the ideology feel like truth. This is the specific psychological knot at the center of Draco's story, and it is the thing that makes his story genuinely complicated, rather than simply the story of a villain who gets a bit softer as the years go on. He was not performing beliefs he secretly rejected. He was holding beliefs that were genuinely part of him, because they had been placed there by the person whose love was the most real thing in his experience. When the war asked him to act on those beliefs in ways that would harm specific people, the beliefs and the love came apart from each other, because what the war required turned out to conflict directly with the love, and the love was older and deeper and more genuinely his than the ideology had ever been. Draco did not have the resources to understand this while it was happening. He was 11, then 12, then 13, then 14, then 15, then 16, and the complexity of his own interior life was not something he had the language or the occasion to examine carefully. What he had was the performance and the love, and the gap between what the performance required and what he was actually capable of, and the gap showed up reliably whenever the performance was tested. In Malfoy Manor, before Hogwarts, the performance was never tested. Everything in the manor confirmed it. The portraits approved, the books supported it, the house elves enacted it, the guests reflected it back. Lucius modelled it with his quiet confidence about the Malfoy family's position. Narcissa expressed it through the care with which she organized Draco's world to match its assumptions. There was no pressure on the performance in the manor. Everything in the manor was inside it. Hogwarts was different. Hogwarts was a place where the performance met other performances, and where the social hierarchy was organized by criteria that did not straightforwardly match the criteria of the Malfoy household. There were brilliant Muggle-born students who outsmarted Draco in subjects he was supposed to find natural. There were students from pure-blood families who were not aligned with the Malfoy family's politics and who were not deferential to the Malfoy name. There was Harry Potter, who was the most famous person in the school and who had turned down the Malfoy handshake and who kept winning in the specific register that mattered most to Draco, which was the register of who was the more significant person in any given moment. The performance was tested by all of this, and the testing was what made the signs visible. Every time the performance failed, it failed by revealing that there was a gap between what Draco claimed and what Draco could do. The gap was different in different years. In his first year, it showed up as screaming in the Forbidden Forest. In his second year, it showed up as the inability to have any actual knowledge of something he was claiming to know about. In his third year, it showed up as the difference between provoking someone and then handing the consequences to your father. The gap was there every year. It just showed up differently depending on what the year required. The Malfoy family's own history contained examples of this gap, if anyone had looked carefully enough. Lucius had served Voldemort, and then survived Voldemort's fall by claiming to have been coerced, which was the family's version of the gap between what they performed and what they were actually prepared to do. The gap was structural. It was the Malfoy family's actual relationship to the ideology it performed. The specific shape of Draco's cruelty throughout his first 3 years deserves more examination than it usually receives, because the shape tells you more than the cruelty itself. When people talk about Draco Malfoy as a bully, they are accurately describing what his behavior produced in the people around him. But the specific mechanism of the bullying, the particular architecture of how he inflicted what he inflicted, reveals something that the label of bully does not fully capture. He was skilled at finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them through the safest available means. He identified what hurt people most and found the sharpest instrument for reaching that hurt, while keeping himself insulated from any meaningful consequence. He used words rather than wands, because words were harder to prosecute and could not be directly traced in the way that spells could. He used his father's name and connections rather than his own physical force, because his father's institutional power was more effective than anything Draco could produce on his own, and carried no personal exposure. He used the performance of authority rather than its actual exercise, because performing authority was something he had been doing all his life, and it was significantly safer than actually having to produce the authority himself when it was challenged. The way this played out in his years at Hogwarts had a particular consistency. He would identify a target. He would assess what the target cared about most, what their position in the school hierarchy was, what their vulnerabilities were. He would find the most effective available instrument for producing the damage he wanted to produce. He would deploy that instrument in a public context where other students could witness the deployment and where the damage was therefore social as well as personal. And he would do all of this while maintaining enough distance from the act that he was not directly exposed to the consequences. This is the behavior of someone who wants the results of power and violence without the personal exposure that genuine power and violence require. The wanting is real. The gap between the wanting and the doing is also real, and the gap is what produces the specific architecture of how Draco actually operated. Consider the sequence of his treatment of Neville Longbottom across the first several years. Neville was, in the hierarchy of first-year Gryffindors, the student most clearly lacking in the qualities that Hogwarts placed highest. He was not naturally good at magic in the straightforward way that talent sometimes displays itself from the beginning. He was frightened of teachers, frightened of making mistakes, frightened of the social judgments of his peers in ways that were visible and that made him an obvious target for someone looking for a target. He came from a pure-blood family, which meant Draco could not use the blood purity language against him, the way he used it against Muggle-born students. But he found other instruments. He mocked Neville's performance in potions and charms and defense. He made comments in corridors about Neville's lack of ability. He encouraged Crabbe and Goyle to laugh at things Neville did wrong in public. He created an atmosphere of consistent low-grade cruelty around Neville that had the effect of making Neville's already difficult school experience significantly more difficult. None of this required Draco to do anything that could be punished, or that required personal courage. All of it was at the level of social aggression that was uncomfortable enough to be effective and ambiguous enough to be difficult to address officially. When Neville's Remembrall was taken from him by Draco during a flying lesson, and Draco flew up with it before anyone could intervene, and Harry flew after him to get it back and managed to catch the Remembrall after Draco threw it, Draco's response to being bested was not a confrontation with Harry. It was a report to Madame Hooch about what Harry had done, an attempt to get Harry punished through the school's authority structure for having broken the rule about first years not being permitted to fly without supervision, even though Harry had broken that rule in response to something Draco himself had started. The mechanism was identical to what Draco would use against Hagrid over Buckbeak in his 3rd year. Someone had done something that could be reported to authority. He reported it. He stepped back and let the authority handle the situation. The difference between his response to Neville's Remembrall and his response to Buckbeak was scale, not structure. In one case, he was trying to get a fellow student in trouble with a teacher. In the other, he was trying to get a creature executed through the ministry. The structure was the same. Ron Weasley occupied a different place in Draco's targeting than either Harry or Neville. Harry was the primary antagonist, the one whose position in the school hierarchy consistently bested Draco in ways that wounded him. Neville was an easy target in the way that anyone visibly struggling is an easy target. Ron was something else, a reminder of a kind of pure-blood family that had made choices the Malfoy household considered a betrayal of everything the bloodlines should have meant. The Weasley family was pure blood. The Weasleys had been magical for many generations. They were, by the standards of blood purity ideology, exactly the kind of family that the Malfoys and the Blacks believed deserved the wizarding world's respect. And they had chosen, consistently and visibly, to reject the ideology that blood purity implied. They had Muggle-born students as friends. They were aligned with Dumbledore. They believed in a wizarding world that included everyone with magical talent, regardless of ancestry. Arthur Weasley had a genuine and joyful interest in Muggle objects and technology that was, by Malfoy household standards, a kind of embarrassment. For Draco, the Weasleys represented a specific kind of betrayal, the betrayal of people who had the right ancestry and had chosen not to use it correctly. He called them blood traitors, which was the ideological term for pure-blood families who allied themselves with Muggle-born witches and wizards, and who rejected the hierarchies that blood purity ideology organized. He said this word with the particular venom that people direct at those who have disappointed expectations that felt reasonable, which is to say he directed it at the Weasleys with more personal feeling than he directed the blood purity language at Muggle-born students. This tells you something about where the ideology sat for Draco. It was not an abstract principle about the nature of magic or the genetics of the wizarding world. It was a social map, organized around the specific families who occupied it, and families who did not occupy the positions the map assigned them were a problem that produced a visceral response. The Weasleys, who should have been allies by the standards of the map, were enemies by virtue of their choices, and the specificity of that enmity was more personal than the more generalized contempt for Muggle-born students. He never managed to actually harm Ron in any way that mattered. Every attempt to use Ron's family, his family's poverty, his family's political positions, his family's association with Dumbledore as material for social damage ran into the specific difficulty that Ron was not particularly wounded by Draco's attacks on the Weasley name. Ron knew his family was not wealthy. Ron knew his family was considered traitors by the Malfoys. These facts did not humiliate him the way Draco's attacks on Harry's fame, or Neville's incompetence, or Hermione's blood status landed on their targets. Ron's relationship to his family's poverty and political positioning was more comfortable than Draco's attacks assumed it would be. This frustrated Draco in ways that were visible. He kept returning to the material, the old house, and the shabby clothes, and the hand-me-down school supplies, and the generally reduced circumstances of the Weasley family's daily life, because he had been taught that these things were humiliating, and he expected them to function as humiliating when deployed. When they did not function the way he expected, he had no recourse except to keep using the same ineffective instrument. The pattern across his first 3 years was one in which Draco consistently identified targets and consistently deployed instruments that were available to him, and consistently found that the instruments fell short of producing the effect he wanted in any meaningful or lasting way. Harry kept beating him in Quidditch and in the more abstract contest of who was the more significant person. Neville suffered and was diminished by the treatment, but did not disappear or give up in the way that would have satisfied the thing Draco was trying to produce. Hermione thrived academically in ways that made the blood purity attacks on her look increasingly disconnected from the reality of who she actually was in the school's intellectual landscape. The inadequacy of his instruments was a sign. The instruments he used were the instruments of someone operating at a remove from genuine power, borrowing what was available, deploying it at a distance, staying safe behind the wall of social ambiguity and institutional authority and family connections. The instruments worked in the short term and at the level of individual incidents, and did not produce any result that changed the general situation. The Triwizard Tournament had its own particular way of pressing on the gap between Draco's performance and his actual capacities, and the way it pressed was through the tournament's tendency to produce situations where what mattered was personal courage of a specific kind, the kind where the performance fell away and what remained was whatever was actually there. The tournament required its 3 champions to face tasks that were physically dangerous in direct and undeniable ways. A dragon, an underwater hostage scenario, a maze full of dark magic, and the final encounter that none of the champions could have anticipated. Harry Potter faced all 3 of these tasks, and came through them with the specific quality that the tasks were designed to test: the capacity to act under pressure when the acting required something genuinely personal and genuinely risky. Draco was not a champion. This is a relevant fact. He was not selected by the Goblet of Fire to face the tasks. He watched the tournament from the position of a spectator, a bystander, someone whose relationship to events was expressed through commentary rather than participation. He wore his badges, and he commented from the safe position of someone who had no stake in the outcomes that his opinion was about. The contrast between what Harry had to do during the tournament and what Draco was doing during the same period is the contrast between genuine risk and the performance of consequence-free contempt. Harry was underwater in a Scottish lake in February, navigating the water and the weed and the merpeople and the time constraint because the task required him to be. Draco was in the stands wearing a badge that said, "Potter stinks." This is not a moral judgment about Draco's position as spectator, which was the position all other students occupied. It is an observation about what the comparison reveals. When the tournament put Harry in situations that required him to be actually present in his own body, in his own risk, Harry was actually present. When the tournament put Draco in the position of spectator with an opinion about what was happening, Draco occupied that position thoroughly and without any visible sign that he understood the difference between the 2 positions. The World Cup, which preceded the tournament in the same school year, had already shown something about how Draco responded to situations that were genuinely dangerous rather than socially managed. The campsite chaos and the dark mark in the sky and the violence done to the Muggle camp workers in the dark was a situation where the danger was real and immediate, and where the specific ideology Draco had been performing for 3 years was being expressed as visible violence against specific people. He had responded by warning Hermione. Then he had adjusted the response to something that looked more like the ideology required him to look, but the adjustment came after. The gap between the first response and the adjusted response is the gap between what was actually there and what the performance required to be there. The first response was faster and more direct and less managed than the adjusted one. The first response told you more. After Cedric Diggory's death, something changed in the quality of what was coming, that Draco could feel in the way that you feel changes in atmospheric pressure before weather arrives. The war that had been abstract and manageable at a social distance was now producing specific people who were dead. Cedric was 17. He was a Hogwarts student. He was someone Draco had shared corridors with. He had come back from the 3rd task as a body. This was different in quality from the general threat of a war that had ended before you were born, and that existed primarily as your family's complicated history. Draco did not have a framework for the difference. He was 14, and he had been raised in a household where the First War was managed through story and performance, and the specific version of events that Lucius had needed to tell. He had not been prepared for what it felt like when the story became a specific dead person who had attended the same school. He went home at the end of his 4th year to a manor that was preparing itself, in ways that were not yet explicit, for something that was coming. Lucius knew Voldemort was back. Lucius had felt the dark mark burn. The summer of 1995 was the summer of a household in transition, moving from one version of itself to another, not yet able to articulate what the new version required. In his 5th year, the inquisitorial squad role had given Draco the closest thing to genuine institutional power he had ever personally held, rather than borrowed from his father or claimed through his family's reputation. The inquisitorial squad badge was his, given to him by Umbridge on the basis of his specific usefulness to her specific project. He had earned it in the narrow sense that Umbridge had selected him rather than someone else, had found his particular combination of cunning and family connections and willingness to enforce uncomfortable things against people he disliked to be exactly what her squad needed. He used the role with an efficiency and an attention to detail that he had not applied to academic work since at least his 2nd year. He monitored, he reported, he assisted in catching the Dumbledore's army members when the meeting location was compromised. He was good at the role in the specific way that someone is good at a thing when the thing uses the skills they have actually developed, rather than the skills they have been told they should have. The skills he had actually developed were social intelligence, and the ability to identify vulnerabilities, and the patience to wait for the right moment to exploit them. These were the skills the Inquisitorial Squad needed. He had developed them across 5 years of operating in the specific social environment of Hogwarts under Slytherin, where the kind of dominance available to him required those skills. He brought them to the squad role, and the squad role rewarded them. What the role also demonstrated, somewhat to one side of his own awareness, was what kind of power actually suited him. The Inquisitorial Squad role was institutional power, authorized from above, exercised within a structure that provided both authority and accountability to the authority that had granted it. He was good at using power this way. He was not good at, and had never been good at, generating power from nothing, creating it through personal force in situations where no institution was backing him up. This distinction was the same distinction that had been visible since the Forbidden Forest in his first year, but the 5th year made it visible in its positive form rather than its negative one. The positive form was, here is what Draco is capable of when the right institutional backing is present and the task plays to his actual skills. The negative form, which had been visible in every situation where the backing was absent or where the task required something his actual skills could not provide, was, here is what Draco cannot do. What Draco could not do was produce genuine violence from genuine conviction. What he could do was identify vulnerabilities and exploit them through available systems, and maintain a performance of authority and certainty that was convincing in environments where no one was testing it at the level of what it actually cost. The year before the Dark Lord's full return was the year these limitations became not merely social facts, but strategic facts. Voldemort needed people who could produce genuine violence from genuine conviction. He needed people like Bellatrix, who could inflict the Cruciatus Curse with such commitment that the curse produced its full effect. He needed people who had been in service to his cause long enough that their service had cost them something real, who had proven their commitment through sacrifice, rather than through family connections. Draco was the son of a man who had failed the Dark Lord. He had family connections and a pure blood lineage and access to the manor. He had not yet been asked to prove anything at the level of genuine commitment. The task of killing Dumbledore was the first time he was asked to prove something at that level, and the asking was itself a punishment rather than an expression of confidence. The year that followed, the 6th year, was Draco's education in the difference between what was required and what he was. The 4th year at Hogwarts began with the Quidditch World Cup, and the World Cup provided the clearest evidence yet of what Draco Malfoy was actually made of when ideology left the space of social performance and became a visible event in the world. The Ireland-Bulgaria match was one of the most anticipated events in the wizarding calendar for that year, and the campsite at the stadium gathered hundreds of thousands of witches and wizards from all over the world in the days before the match. The Malfoy family had excellent seats, as they always had at events that demonstrated social standing through access. Draco came to the World Cup with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been given something that confirms what they already believed about their position. The match itself was extraordinary, the kind of sporting event that generates stories people repeat for years afterward. Victor Crum's Vronsky feint, the Irish chasers' coordination, the atmosphere in the stadium. Draco, who cared about Quidditch in the way that people care about things that have always been available to them, observed it all with appropriate appreciation and moved through the event with the ease of someone who belongs at such occasions. After the match, when the celebration was well underway, and the campsite was lit with the particular warm disorder of tens of thousands of people who have watched something exceptional and are now processing the experience together, the chaos that changed the evening arrived quickly and from several directions at once. A group of former Death Eaters, moving through the tents in a cluster, levitated several Muggle camp workers and marched them through the campsite. The workers were levitated high enough that their struggling was visible against the lit sky, moving in the direction the group controlling them chose, unable to do anything about what was happening to them. The people around them scattered, the celebrations collapsed into flight and confusion, children were separated from parents, the ministry personnel who had been managing the event were overwhelmed almost immediately. Then someone fired the dark mark into the sky above the trees at the edge of the campsite. The enormous green skull with its tongue of serpent rose above the forest and hung there, lit against the night sky, visible for miles in every direction. The effect on the campsite was immediate and total. The wizarding community had spent 13 years rebuilding after the First War, telling itself and its children that the worst was over, that the Dark Lord was gone, that the symbol hanging in the sky was something that only old people remembered with genuine fear. Then the symbol was in the sky, and the fear it had always carried was present and entirely justified, and people ran. In the dark at the edge of the trees, in the chaos that followed the mark's appearance, Harry and Hermione and Ron encountered Draco. He was positioned near cover. He was not gloating. He was not performing ideological satisfaction. He looked at Hermione, and he said something that, in the moment, came out before he had time to compose it. He said she ought to be careful, what with a mark like that in the sky, and people like her being the sort they were. Then the performance reasserted itself. He said other things, snide things, things that maintained the posture of someone who found all of this satisfying from the right vantage point. But the first thing had already been said. The unguarded moment had already happened. The warning is the sign worth examining. Draco had spent 3 years performing alignment with an ideology that organized its contempt specifically around the category of witch or wizard that Hermione Granger occupied. He had used the slur against her. He had positioned himself publicly, in dozens of small ways, as someone who shared the beliefs that the dark mark in the sky was associated with. And when the dark mark was actually in the sky, and the violence it represented was actually happening in the dark around them, his first unrehearsed response was not satisfaction. It was something that functioned as a warning to someone the ideology had categorized as an appropriate target. He caught himself. He adjusted. But the adjustment came after the first thing, and the first thing was the real thing. This could not have been what his family intended when they gave him the beliefs he had been given. The ideology, as the Malfoy household practiced it, was supposed to produce a certain kind of response to events like the one at the campsite. It was supposed to produce, if not approval, then at least indifference to the targets of the violence, an understanding that what was happening to the right people, and that the discomfort one felt about seeing it was simply the discomfort of proximity. Instead, it produced a warning, a quick, unguarded, genuine alert directed at someone the ideology had said should not be warned. This told you something. Not that Draco was secretly sympathetic to Muggle-born witches and wizards. Not at this point in his life. Not in any conscious or consistently practiced way. It told you that the ideology had not gone all the way down in him. It was real at the surface, absorbed and practiced and present in his language and his social behavior, but underneath it was something else. Something that responded to the actual sight of actual violence, directed at an actual person, in ways that did not follow from the ideology. The actual sight of it, at close range, in the dark, was different from the ideology as atmosphere. That was the distinction he had never been required to confront until the World Cup, and the confrontation revealed the gap. Draco spent the Tri-Wizard tournament year deploying his most domesticated form of cruelty. The badges, which said, "Support Cedric Diggory, the real Hogwarts champion," on one side, and Potter Stinks on the other, were produced and distributed with the particular pleasure of someone who has identified a clever instrument. They were clever. They required no courage. They caused no real harm. They were exactly the kind of thing that Draco was skilled at, the expression of contempt in its most refined and consequence-free form. He distributed them throughout the school. He wore his own prominently. He gave them to people who asked, and pressed them on people who didn't. He found, in the badge campaign, a way to make the entire Tri-Wizard tournament feel like a social contest he was winning, because the social contest was the one Draco was most comfortable in, the one where the stakes were low enough that the gap between his performance and his actual capacity did not become visible. He also performed his particular version of mockery of Harry's standing in the tournament, finding ways to suggest that Harry had not truly earned his position, that the whole thing was another example of the kind of special treatment Harry received that he did not deserve. This was consistent with the wounded pride logic that had organized Draco's relationship with Harry since the rejected handshake on the train in their first year. Harry kept getting things Draco felt he deserved more, and the badge campaign was a way of registering that disagreement in a form that everyone could see. When Mad-Eye Moody, who was actually Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise, but whose instinct for dealing with Draco was accurate, transformed him into a ferret for attempting to hex Harry from behind while Harry's back was turned. The scene that followed was a particular kind of complete humiliation. Moody as Crouch bounced the ferret across the entrance hall floor repeatedly, the thump of small mammal against stone repeated in front of students from all 4 houses, until McGonagall intervened and had Draco restored to human form. He emerged from inside Goyle's clothing, looking precisely as someone would look in those circumstances. His response was nothing. He did not attempt to retaliate against Moody as Crouch. He did not find any mechanism through which to address the humiliation. The teacher held ministry-sanctioned authority, and that authority was, in Draco's operational model, a wall he could not approach. He was adept at using authority and adept at sheltering behind it, but authority wielded against him from a position high enough that his family's connections could not reach. It was simply something he endured. He muttered. He sulked. He distributed more Potter Stinks badges, with visible additional aggression for several days. Then the tournament moved on. Cedric Diggory died at the end of the year. He was killed in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, murdered by Peter Pettigrew, on Voldemort's instruction, in the context of a ritual that restored Voldemort to a body. Cedric was 17. He was a prefect, a Quidditch player, a student who had been at school with Draco for 4 years. He was someone Draco's classmates knew and had watched and had cheered for during the Triwizard Tournament. He came back from the 3rd task as a body. Dumbledore announced his death to the school in the Great Hall that night. Whatever he said about what had happened and how it had happened, what was communicated was that a student had been killed and that the killing had been done by someone from outside the school, and that the Dark Lord's name was connected to it. The room received this information in the particular silence that follows a statement that is too large to respond to immediately. Draco's response was not recorded. He was not in the graveyard. He had not known what was planned for the 3rd task. What he thought and felt in the Great Hall that night, if anything was visible in his face, was absorbed into the general distress of a student body that had just been told something it could not fully process. But Cedric's death changed the shape of what was coming, in a way that Draco could not have avoided registering. Voldemort was back in a body. The Dark Lord who had given his father the Dark Mark, and who Lucius had served, and then claimed not to have served, was back in the world with a physical form and the capacity to act. The First War had ended with Draco's family narrowly surviving. The Second War, which had just effectively begun on a night in June in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, was going to ask something of the Malfoy family that the Imperius story would not cover. Draco came back to Hogwarts for his 5th year as someone who understood this, at least at the level of knowing that the landscape had changed, even if he did not have a clear picture of what the new landscape required. Dolores Umbridge arrived at the school at the same time, sent by Cornelius Fudge to undermine Dumbledore's authority and manage the Ministry's official position, which was that Voldemort had not returned, and that the claims to the contrary were either mistaken or actively malicious. Umbridge was pink and small, and smiled frequently, and held educational decrees as her primary mechanism for control. She began issuing them within weeks of arriving: restrictions on student organizations, requirements for ministry approval of gatherings, limitations on what could be said and taught and discussed in the school. She was precise and systematic, and thoroughly committed to the institutional project she had been sent to execute. Draco recognized what she offered and moved toward it. He was made a member of the Inquisitorial Squad, the enforcement arm she created to extend her authority into the spaces she could not cover herself. He was given the badge and the mandate and the backing of someone who held ministry authority in the school. He applied himself to the role with more consistent effort than he had ever applied to any academic subject. He took points from students in other houses. He monitored Hogsmeade visits. He assisted in identifying and reporting rule violations. He helped catch members of Dumbledore's army when a betrayal led Umbridge to their meeting location. In all of these functions, he was efficient and reliable, and carried out what the role required, with a kind of satisfaction that was visible in how he moved through the school during that period. But the critical fact about his 5th year is what Draco was actually aligned with. Umbridge and Fudge were working to suppress the acknowledgement that Voldemort had returned. Draco's service to Umbridge was therefore, in the specific logic of the political situation, service to an agenda that ran against acknowledging his own family's Dark Lord. The Ministry was using Umbridge to discredit Dumbledore, who was the main source insisting that Voldemort was back and that the wizarding world needed to respond to that fact. Draco was helping the Ministry discredit Dumbledore. This was not a contradiction Draco had the resources to process. He was 15, and he was not thinking about ideological coherence. He was thinking about available authority and what it offered him. Umbridge had power in the immediate environment. Aligning with that power produced concrete benefits: the badge, the authority to take points from Gryffindors, the position that let him make the daily lives of people he disliked more difficult. These were the same benefits he had sought through every other borrowed authority available to him since his first year. He used Umbridge exactly as he had used his father's name in his first year, and his father's Ministry connections in his third year, and the mechanisms of school discipline to get Harry and Hermione in detention over Norbert. The ideology was available as a framing for what he was doing, but the actual motivation was personal. The inquisitorial squad role was satisfying to Draco because it let him do to people with official backing what he had only been able to do through social aggression before. When the Death Eaters fought the Order of the Phoenix in the Department of Mysteries, and Sirius Black fell through the veil, and Harry watched someone he loved die in a room full of prophecies, Draco was at Hogwarts. He had not been summoned to the Ministry. He had not been included in the operation. The Death Eaters who went that night were people who had been serving Voldemort with genuine commitment since the First War, or who had proven their loyalty in some other way. Draco had not proven anything. He had proven himself useful in a school setting. This was not the same thing. He remained at school while the battle happened in London. He learned about it the way students learned about it, from information filtering through accounts that made the events sound both extraordinary and far away. Lucius had been arrested in the battle's aftermath. The Imperius story was no longer available as cover. The alignment was now unmistakable in the record. Draco came home at the end of that year to a household where his father was in Azkaban, and where the war that had been abstract and manageable at a distance was now present in the specific form of consequences for specific choices. The summer before his 6th year was the summer that everything changed, because the world around the Malfoy family had reorganized itself in a way that the Malfoy family's customary tools could not address. If this story is carrying you towards sleep, please take just a moment before you close your eyes to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Members of the channel receive new episodes first. The playlist holds more stories whenever you want to return. Now, back to the summer that changed everything for Draco. Voldemort held the meeting at a location outside the manor in the early months after the Ministry disaster. The gathered Death Eaters understood that the meeting was a reckoning of some kind, an accounting of what had gone wrong and what it would cost. Lucius had failed. He had been sent to retrieve the prophecy and had returned not merely without it, but in Ministry custody, captured and exposed in a way that removed the last fiction of the Imperius defense. Whatever protection the claim of coercion had once provided was gone. Voldemort's punishment for Lucius took the form it took because Voldemort had always understood that the most effective punishments were the ones that reached the person being punished through the thing they loved most. For Lucius Malfoy, the thing he loved most was not his standing at the Ministry, or his seat on the Hogwarts school board, or his considerable wealth. It was his family, Narcissa, Draco. Voldemort assigned Draco the task of killing Albus Dumbledore. He delivered the assignment the way he delivered everything, as though it were already decided, and the only variable was execution. He gave it to a 16-year-old boy with no meaningful Death Eater experience, and a record of having never actually harmed anyone in any way that counted. He gave it because the task was designed to fail. A boy Draco's age, with Draco's background and Draco's capacities, killing the most powerful wizard in the world was not a realistic outcome. It was a frame around a punishment. If by some extraordinary chance Draco succeeded, Dumbledore was dead and the war advanced. If Draco failed, the failure became the lesson. Look at what incompetence costs. Look at what it costs to fail the Dark Lord. Look at what it costs your family. Every other Death Eater in the room could read this. Narcissa could read it the moment she heard. She understood that her son had been handed an assignment designed to destroy him, and she did what she did when the thing she loved most was threatened. She went to Severus Snape alone. She went to his house, to the small and grimly furnished place where Snape lived in his post-Hogwarts hours, and she asked him to take the unbreakable vow. Bellatrix was with her, and Bellatrix objected to the visit on the grounds that it implied doubt about Draco's capabilities, and Narcissa ignored Bellatrix's objection because Narcissa had no time for the ideology when her son's life was in the balance. The vow bound Snape to watch over Draco during the year, to assist him where possible, and to complete the task himself if Draco could not. Narcissa had looked at the situation clearly, without sentimentality or self-deception, and had seen that the task was beyond her son's capacity, and had arranged for someone to be present for the moment when that incapacity became visible. She did this because she loved her son, and understood exactly what he was. Draco came back to Hogwarts for his 6th year, carrying the knowledge of what he had been asked to do, and the complete inability to share it with anyone. He could not go to a teacher, he could not go to the headmaster, who was the target. He could not go to Pansy Parkinson, who would have been terrified and helpless. He could not go to Crabbe or Goyle, who were loyal in the straightforward way of dogs, and who would have handled the information extremely badly. He arrived at the school with the task sitting inside him, like something foreign, that he could not remove, and could not stop being aware of. The plan involved the 2 vanishing cabinets. There was one at Borgin and Burke's, the shop in Nocturne Alley that specialized in dark and powerful objects, a place Draco had visited with his father on one of those childhood shopping trips that were supposed to be educational, about the real texture of the wizarding world. There was another at Hogwarts, in the Room of Requirement, where it had sat unused for years. The Room of Hidden Things held 1,000 years of objects that students had placed there when they needed to conceal something, and the cabinet had been sitting among them since someone had used it for that purpose years before. The cabinets were a matched pair, connected by a magical correspondence that caused objects placed in one to appear in the other. If Draco could repair the Hogwarts cabinet and restore the correspondence, he could create a passage directly into the school that bypassed everything Dumbledore had built into its defenses. The wards, the protective enchantments, the careful arrangements against exactly this kind of unauthorized entry would mean nothing to someone stepping through a piece of furniture from a shop in Nocturne Alley. The beauty and the horror of this plan, for Draco, was that it was achievable. He could work toward it. He could measure his progress. He could test the mechanism, and adjust and test again, and know whether he was getting closer to something functional. The actual killing was different. The actual killing had no steps toward it that could be measured, no mechanism he could repair, no way to know whether he was getting better at the thing or not. The cabinet gave him something to do in the middle of a year that otherwise consisted entirely of getting closer to something he could not do. He sent birds through it. In the early months, the birds that arrived in Borgin and Burke's on the other end arrived dead. He adjusted his approach, modified the mechanism based on what he understood about the magical correspondence principle, sent more birds. Some arrived damaged rather than dead. He made further adjustments. Some arrived in pieces. He spent weeks on specific problems that revealed themselves in the results, and that he had to work out solutions for without access to any expert guidance, because telling someone what he was working on was not possible. The cost of this showed in him across the months of the year. He lost weight steadily from October onward, not dramatically, not suddenly, but consistently. The robes that had always fitted precisely began to hang. His color went past his ordinary pale into something that looked like the absence of health, rather than simply the particular complexion of his family's line. His eyes had the quality of someone who was not sleeping enough, which was accurate, because the work in the Room of Requirement consumed the hours that sleep would have required. Pansy Parkinson noticed. She noticed the way that someone who has known a person for 5 years and has been paying attention notices changes that accumulate slowly and become undeniable before they are easy to name. She asked him things, and he gave her answers that were true in a narrow technical sense, and that conveyed nothing about the actual situation. He was managing something, she could see that, but he could not tell her what, and she could not reach past the surface he maintained to find out. Teachers noticed. McGonagall observed the change across the autumn term and filed it under the category of possible personal difficulties or academic stress without being able to identify the specific cause. Slughorn, who had taken a particular interest in Draco as the son of a family with the right connections, noticed that the boy who had walked into his first class with the familiar Malfoy confidence was walking into classes by November, looking like someone who was managing something continuous and unresolvable. Harry noticed with a particular and urgent attention. He had been following Draco's movements on the Marauder's map since the year began, observing patterns that did not correspond to ordinary school behavior, tracking the frequency of visits to places that were not classrooms or the common room. He tried to tell Dumbledore. Dumbledore listened and was not dismissive, but indicated that Draco was not the focus Harry needed to maintain that year, and that Harry had his own assignments to attend to. This was true. Dumbledore was conducting the Horcrux hunt with Harry in private sessions, showing him memories, building the picture of what Voldemort had done to try to make himself immortal, preparing Harry for the final confrontation in ways Harry could not yet fully see. Within that project, the question of what Draco Malfoy was doing in the Room of Requirements several times a week was something Dumbledore had already accounted for, because Snape had told him what the task was, because Snape had taken the unbreakable vow and had reported to Dumbledore what that vow required. Dumbledore was not uninformed about Draco's year. He was managing its end himself, in a way that Harry was not party to. The birds coming through the cabinet went from dead to damaged to whole across the months of winter and early spring. By the time the Easter holidays came and went, the mechanism was nearly functional. Draco was arriving at the end of the thing he had been working toward, the end that was the beginning of the thing he could not work toward. The bathroom scene happened in the spring term, months before the end point of the year. Harry had been tracking Draco's movements and had followed him to Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, the girls' bathroom on the second floor, where Myrtle had died in Draco's second year, and where she had remained, complaining and observing, and available for conversation with the living, when the living needed someone who would not carry the information anywhere else. Draco was at the sink when Harry came through the door. His robes were slightly wrong, as though he had been standing there long enough that he had stopped thinking about them. He was talking to Myrtle in the way of someone who has run out of places where talking is safe and has arrived at a ghost as the option that presents no risk of the information going anywhere dangerous. And he was crying. The kind of crying that does not preserve the face or control the sound, that does not permit the person doing it to maintain any sense of how they look, the uncontrolled kind. He was saying he did not know what to do. He was saying there were things he had to do that he did not know how to do. He was saying this to a ghost in a bathroom because there was nowhere else to say it, and the need to say it had become too large to continue suppressing. Harry made his presence known, and the scene shifted into a duel. Draco fired the Cruciatus Curse in the panic of being discovered, the reflex of someone who is frightened and armed and has been carrying something terrible long enough that the fright triggers a response, bypassing whatever he normally would have thought before acting. The curse did not land. It did not land the way a fully meant Cruciatus lands, the way Bellatrix's Cruciatus landed. The wizarding world's understanding of that curse was that it required genuine and sustained desire to cause pain at a level the magic could translate into effect. Draco's Cruciatus, fired in the panic of a bathroom, aimed at someone he had hated for 6 years, but whom he had never actually been able to hurt in any way that mattered, was not that kind of Cruciatus. The fight escalated. Harry used Sectum Sempra, a spell from the Half-Blood Prince's annotated textbook, which he had found in a borrowed potions book earlier that year. He did not know what it did when he cast it. He found out in the next second. The spell cut Draco open across his face and chest, blood spreading across the white tile of the bathroom floor, in the way that blood spreads when the wound is serious and immediate. Snape arrived and healed the cuts with the counter-curse that existed for the specific spell, which he knew because the specific spell was his own, one of the hexes he had invented as a student at Hogwarts decades before. He looked at Harry with an expression that was doing several things at once and managed, in that single expression, to convey both the fact that he knew exactly what spell Harry had used and the fact that this information was not something he was going to address in the way Harry expected. Draco lay on the bathroom floor and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The year's endpoint was June. The cabinet was functional. Birds were arriving whole in Borgin and Berks with the reliability of a completed mechanism. The passage was ready. The plan that had been given to Draco was ready to execute. The Death Eaters could come through. They would come through. The thing that remained was the thing that could not be mechanically prepared for, the thing that Draco could not manufacture through months of work in the Room of Requirement, the thing that required something to be present inside him that was not present and that no amount of preparation could install. He knew this. He had known it for some time. This is what the bathroom had been about. The need to say to something, anything, that he did not know how to do what he had been sent to do, that the preparation was complete and the capacity was not. The Vanishing Cabinet project occupied Draco in ways that went beyond the mechanical. He was not just repairing a piece of furniture, he was managing the only available response to an impossible situation. The cabinet was the part of the task he could work on. The actual task, the assassination, was not something he could work on in any direct sense. He could not practice it. He could not make it easier through preparation. He could not test it and adjust and test it again, the way he could test the cabinet with birds. The assassination was simply the thing that was going to be required at the end of the year, and its proximity increased in direct proportion to the cabinet's progress, so that the closer the cabinet came to being functional, the closer he was to the moment when the cabinet's functionality would be useless, without the one thing the cabinet could not provide. He understood this. The understanding was present in him, across the entire year, sitting underneath everything else he did, present in the quality of his sleep, and his appetite, and his color, and the way he moved through the school, when he was not thinking about how he was moving through it. He could not say this to anyone. He could not put the understanding down anywhere, or give it to anyone to hold for him. He was alone with it, which meant the understanding was always with him, always present, always making itself felt in the way that things make themselves felt when they have nowhere else to go. The Moaning Myrtle bathroom was the place where the understanding finally found somewhere to go. Not a resolution, not a person who could take the weight off him, simply a space where he could say the thing out loud, where the unsayable thing could be said to something that could receive it, even something as inadequate for the purpose as the ghost of a schoolgirl who had died in that bathroom decades before. Myrtle was, in a specific and practical sense, the only available option. She was outside the normal social economy of the school. She could not tell anyone who would act on the information in any dangerous way. She had been in that bathroom for decades and was accustomed to the role of recipient, of someone who heard things people could not say anywhere else, because people only came to Myrtle's bathroom when they had something they could not take anywhere else. She was the destination of last resort for what could not be said in the rooms where other people lived. Draco said the things he could not say. He said he did not know how to do what he had to do. He said there were things required of him that he was not capable of producing. He did not say the specific content of the task, but he said the shape of the problem, and the shape was enough for anyone listening who understood anything about what was happening at Hogwarts that year, and what role the Malfoy family occupied in Voldemort's plans, to understand what the shape referred to. Harry heard the shape. What Harry understood from the bathroom was that something was very wrong for Draco, something that went beyond the ordinary difficulties of school life, and that was serious enough to produce the sound that Draco was making. Harry did not process this as evidence of anything that changed his general understanding of Draco. He was still, at that point in his 6th year, convinced that Draco was working for Voldemort in a way that was threatening and that needed to be tracked and stopped. He did not connect what he had heard in the bathroom to the full picture of what was actually happening, which was that Draco was in the bathroom precisely because the task he was supposed to be executing was one he could not execute. The bathroom duel was the scene where the gap between Draco's performance and his capacity showed up in its most visible form in his 6th year, preceding the tower scene by several months. He fired the Cruciatus curse in panic, and it did not land the way a Cruciatus was supposed to land. He tried other things that did not connect. The duel had the quality of someone fighting defensively in a space they had not chosen for a fight, trying to manage a situation that was already out of their control. The Cruciatus that did not land was its own small sign. The curse required, by the magical world's understanding of how dark curses worked, genuine and sustained desire to inflict pain, not the desire of someone who is frightened and is firing reflexively, not the desire of someone who wants the situation to stop, the specific desire to hurt another person at a level that the magic could translate into the full effect of the curse. Bellatrix Lestrange's Cruciatus had that quality. Draco's did not. This was not an accident of timing or circumstances. It was the same thing as the Astronomy Tower, just at a lower register, and without the stakes being quite as clear. He was in a bathroom fighting someone he had hated for 6 years, and he fired the curse associated with the darkest magic, and it did not land properly, because the thing that made it land properly was not present in him, in that context, and had not been present in him, in any context, in which he had actually been required to demonstrate it. He recovered from the bathroom cuts that Harry's reckless Sectum Sempra had opened, and he lay on the floor, and Snape healed him, and looked at Harry with an expression that Harry did not understand, and that carried multiple layers of meaning that would not be intelligible until much later. Draco lay on the bathroom floor and looked at the ceiling. He had been closer to death in that bathroom than in most of the situations he had manufactured his way into proximity with. The proximity had come from Harry's spell, which Harry had not understood when he cast it, and Snape had stopped it, and Draco was alive. He had also not killed Harry in the bathroom. He had not managed to do meaningful damage to Harry in the bathroom, even in a situation where they were alone together, and both of them were trying. He had fired the Cruciatus, and it had not worked. He had tried other things that had not worked. He had been hit by Sectum Sempra, which was Snape's own invented curse, because the fight had escalated past anything Draco was prepared to manage, and Harry had reached for something he did not understand. The bathroom was a microcosm of what the tower would be. In the bathroom, Draco had a target alone, and no reason not to act, and could not act effectively. On the tower, he would have a target disarmed, and he would not act at all. The progression was from ineffective action to no action, across the same year, with the same gap between performance and capacity operating in both cases. The spring term passed. The cabinet kept working. Birds kept arriving whole in Borgin and Berks. The mechanism was complete. Draco went through the final weeks of the school year in the way of someone who can see the end of the path they have been walking, and cannot make the end of the path be something other than what it is. He did not sleep well. He did not eat well. He was present in his classes, and he completed the work that was required of him, and he went through the motions of being a sixth-year student, preparing for examinations, and underneath all of that, he was waiting for something that was coming, and that he had no way of making less inevitable through any of the resources available to him. The signs of this were visible in his face if you knew how to read them, not as guilt or as moral conflict in any straightforward sense, as the face of someone who is carrying something they cannot put down and cannot share. The particular expression of someone who has arrived at the understanding that what they are heading toward is something they are not equipped for, and that the arrival is going to happen regardless. And then it was June. The silence in which Draco carried the sixth year's task was its own kind of evidence. He could not speak about what he was supposed to be doing, not to anyone in the school or anyone in his family, and the enforced silence had a specific texture that people who spent time around him could feel without being able to name. It was the silence of someone who is alone, with something too large to put down, who has nowhere to set it, and no one who can share the weight, who moves through ordinary life making ordinary sounds, while the silence underneath those sounds is doing something different. People under that kind of pressure behave in specific ways. They lose weight because eating requires a level of ordinary attention to physical comfort that the pressure crowds out. They lose sleep because sleep requires the mind to release its hold on what it is managing, and the thing being managed does not permit release. They develop the particular quality of face that comes from managing something continuous, a face that is performing normalcy over something that is not normal, that works harder than a face at rest usually has to work to maintain the ordinary expressions and responses of ordinary social life. Draco had all of these: the weight loss, the sleep loss, the quality of face. These were visible to anyone who had known him before the sixth year and was paying attention. What they were not, to anyone who could see them, was legible. The signs pointed toward difficulty, without pointing toward a specific cause. The cause was the silence he was maintaining around the specific impossible thing he had been asked to do. The silence was itself a sign. A person who has genuinely committed to a cause does not experience it primarily as a weight that produces silence. They experience it as a commitment that produces activity, that generates momentum, that fills the space of daily life with the energy of someone who knows what they are working toward and believes in the working. The genuine Death Eaters, in Voldemort's service during the Second War, were not characterized by a silence of suppression. They were characterized by the energy of people doing what they believed in, sometimes terribly, sometimes with enthusiasm, but not primarily as people being crushed by something they were carrying. Draco's silence was the silence of suppression, not commitment. It was the silence of someone who had been handed a thing they could not carry, and who was carrying it anyway, without the resource of genuine conviction to make the carrying feel like anything other than what it was, the carrying of something too heavy, by someone not built for it. The specific quality of that silence changed across the year. In September it was taut, the silence of someone at the beginning of a long effort who is maintaining control because the endpoint is far enough away that the control is possible. In January it was heavier, still maintained, but at greater cost. By April, the cost was visible in him, in the way his face moved, when he was not thinking about how his face was moving, in the way he occupied the space around him, as though he were trying to take up as little of it as possible. June arrived with the silence at its maximum weight. This was also visible, and also not legible to anyone who saw it, because no one except Snape and Dumbledore knew what specific weight the silence was carrying. Teachers saw a student in difficulty. Other students saw a Draco who was different from the Draco they had known for 5 years. None of them knew that the difference was the difference between someone who had been performing a version of themselves that was now completely unsupportable, and someone who had not yet been required to do what the version required. June arrived, and the version was required, and the version was not there, and what was there instead was the wand that shook, and the arm that came down, and the sound Draco made on the tower, in the clear, cold air above the castle. The night in June was warm and still above the castle. The Astronomy Tower stood at the top of one of the highest turrets of Hogwarts, a narrow platform enclosed by a parapet, used for centuries by students learning the positions of the stars and the movement of planets and the way the sky above Scotland changed across the seasons. It was not a place where anything decisive was supposed to happen. The chain of events that brought Draco there had begun earlier that evening. Dumbledore had taken Harry to a cave on a coast, pursuing a Horcrux that turned out to be a fake, requiring Dumbledore to drink a potion from a stone basin that had done to him something that was not immediately classifiable, but whose effects were visible in how he moved and how he looked by the time they returned to the school. He had been weakened in a way that went past ordinary fatigue. He had been weakened in the way of something working on him from inside. When they appeared above the rooftops of Hogsmeade on their broomsticks, Dumbledore looked up at the highest tower and saw the dark mark hanging in the air above it, the enormous green skull and its serpent tongue, and he knew immediately what it meant. It meant the passage had been used. Death Eaters were in the school. Someone had opened the Vanishing cabinet and walked through. He insisted on going to the tower despite his condition. This insistence had reasons that Harry did not yet understand, reasons that traced back to a conversation months before, in the headmaster's office, between two people who had made arrangements for exactly this moment, in full understanding of what those arrangements required from both of them. He froze Harry where he stood on the landing below the tower door, immobilized him with a non-verbal spell that left Harry invisible under his cloak and unable to move. He said nothing to explain this. He simply immobilized Harry and went up the last steps and pushed open the door. Draco was already there. He had climbed the stairs knowing that the Death Eaters were in the building below, that the plan was in motion, that the moment the year had been pointed toward had arrived. He had been moving toward this point since September. 9 months of preparation had produced this single point, and he had arrived at it. He raised his wand. He said the disarming spell. Dumbledore's wand flew from his hand across the platform, and Draco caught it. He now held, in his left hand, the wand of the most powerful wizard of the age, and in his right hand, his own wand, and Dumbledore was leaning against the stone parapet of the tower, weakened and wandless, and before him. What Draco had done, in disarming Dumbledore, was something whose significance he would not learn until much later. The Elder Wand, whose history of ownership passed through the act of defeat, recognized Draco as its new master at the moment of the disarming. He had beaten Dumbledore with his own spell, had taken the wand from the air, and had become, by the logic the wand followed, the person it answered to. He did not know this. He was holding it as evidence of having completed a step, not as a transfer of magical allegiance. Dumbledore did not attempt to fight. He did not try to recover the wand, or produce another spell, or flee, or create a distraction. He leaned against the parapet, and he looked at Draco, and he was not afraid. The absence of fear in Dumbledore's face was one of the things that made what followed so strange for Draco to navigate. He had rehearsed this moment in his head across the months of the year, in the small hours in the room of requirement, in the bathroom with Myrtle, in the half-asleep space between exhaustion and actual rest. In none of those rehearsals had the target been calm. In none of them had the target looked at him the way Dumbledore was looking at him now, with an expression that contained something that Draco recognized reluctantly as compassion. He kept his wand raised. He told Dumbledore to disarm himself. He told Dumbledore not to try anything. His voice was not steady. The things he said were the things you say in the situation, when the situation is not what you had rehearsed, and the words are filling space while the gap between what needs to happen and what you are capable of doing stays exactly where it is. Dumbledore said his name twice. The way you say a name twice when you want to establish that you are talking to a person rather than a symbol or a character in a story someone else wrote. Then he said it. You are not a killer. He said it with the certainty of a fact rather than the tone of an appeal. He was not trying to persuade Draco of something Draco did not believe. He was stating something that he had observed across 6 years of watching a student develop, something he had access to, that Draco had been unable to access from inside his own experience. He had watched the year from a position where he knew what Snape had reported, what the unbreakable vow had required, what the task had asked of Draco, and what Draco had been able to produce in response to it. He had been watching, and he knew. Draco began to cry. The sound on the tower was wrong, in the way sounds are wrong when they appear in contexts they do not belong to. The night was clear and still. The castle below was in chaos. The Death Eaters were moving through the corridors. And at the top of the Astronomy Tower, the sound that came from Draco Malfoy was the sound of 9 months of something finally finding a way out. The fear and the isolation, and the months of sending birds through the cabinet, and the knowledge underneath all of it that he could not do what he had been sent to do. All of it was in the sound. His wand arm was shaking. Harry, frozen and invisible on the stairs, could see the arm from where he stood, and the shaking was unmistakable. The arm was not holding steady. It was moving in small arcs, dropping by degrees, the line of aim wavering away from Dumbledore, and then back, and then further away. A steady arm fires. A shaking arm is fighting itself, fighting the gap between the position and the action, and Draco's arm had been fighting that gap for 9 months. Dumbledore offered him a way through. He said that the Order of the Phoenix could protect Draco and his mother. He said there was a way out of this that did not require what the tower required. He said it without urgency, without the quality of a last-ditch negotiation, in the measured tone of someone stating an available option. He said it the way you say something true, when you know the person you are saying it to is running out of time to hear it, and you want to make sure it is said before that time runs out. The offer of protection for Narcissa landed in Draco differently from how any other element of the offer could have landed. Not the protection of himself, which would have been easier to refuse, the protection of his mother, the thing that had organized his emotional life since before he could name it, the center of the world from which everything else extended. The wand arm came down, by fractions, across what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute, not to his side, not all the way down, but the line of aim was no longer pointed at anything. The arm had been lowering itself across the months of the year, degree by degree, and on the tower, it completed the movement it had been making since September. Then the door opened behind him, and the Death Eaters came through it. They arrived in a group, several of them, having moved through the castle from the Room of Requirement, where they had come through the Vanishing Cabinet. Amicus Carrow, and Alecto Carrow, and Fenrir Greyback, and others. They took in the scene on the platform with the efficiency of people who have come to complete a task, and immediately see that the preliminary stages are still incomplete. Dumbledore against the parapet. Draco with his arm at an angle that was not aimed at anything. The evidence of what had not happened. The pressure was immediate. Amicus urged Draco forward. The others waited in the cold open air. They had come through a passage that Draco had spent 9 months repairing, and they had climbed the tower, and they were standing on the platform, and the work of the evening was not done, because the boy who was supposed to have done it had been standing here with a wandering aim and a wet face. Draco did not move. He held his ground on the tower, and the wand that had been raised at Dumbledore continued to drift in small movements, without being aimed at anything, and without being lowered entirely. He was there, and the Death Eaters were there, and Dumbledore was there, and nothing was moving toward resolution. Severus Snape came through the door. He walked onto the platform and read the scene with the single sweeping look of someone who has been briefed on every element of what is happening. and who arrived expecting to find exactly what he found. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at him. Between them passed something that had been arranged months before, in a conversation in the headmaster's office that no one else had been party to, a conversation in which two old and complicated allies had agreed on the thing that needed to happen, and who would be responsible for making it happen. Dumbledore's face in the moment before Snape raised his wand had the quality of a request. Not fear, not resignation. A specific request directed at a specific person who had taken a vow to be there for exactly this. Snape said the incantation. He said the killing curse, and it left his wand and struck Dumbledore, and Dumbledore was lifted from the parapet, and he fell. The green light that carried the curse lit the tower briefly, then it was gone, and the night was ordinary again, and Dumbledore was gone, and Draco was still standing on the platform, alive, not having done what he had been sent to do. Snape had done it. The unbreakable vow had been fulfilled in the way Narcissa had anticipated when she made Snape take it, the way Dumbledore had anticipated when he had his private conversation with Snape about what the year required. The task was complete, and Draco had not completed it. He fled the school with the Death Eaters. He went because there was nothing else to do. The year had ended in the way it had ended, with the thing done but done by someone else, and Draco went through the door and down the stairs, and through the castle that was in chaos, and out onto the grounds, and away. He was 16 years old, and he had spent 9 months preparing to do something he could not do, and someone else had done it, and he was running, because the running was the only available next step. The summer that followed was the summer of the world Voldemort had made, which was increasingly the world that everyone else also had to live in. The Malfoy family's position in this world was uncomfortable in specific ways. Lucius was not yet released from Azkaban. Narcissa maintained the manor, and whatever surface the Malfoy household was still capable of presenting. Draco was 17, and had survived his 6th year by not doing the thing the 6th year had required, and the failure had not been punished in the way he had feared, because the outcome Voldemort needed had been achieved through Snape, and Snape's position with Voldemort was secure in ways that protected Draco from the most immediate consequences. But he was not free of the situation. He was in it, more than ever before, living in a house that Voldemort was treating as his own headquarters, moving through rooms where meetings happened and prisoners were kept, and the machinery of a war that his family had been part of and could not leave was operating around him daily. The 7th year was that. It was the year of occupation, the year of the Dark Lord in residence, the year of trying to take up as little space as possible in a house that had once been entirely yours. Voldemort held meetings in the dining room of Malfoy Manor. He used the long table that Draco had eaten dinner at through his entire childhood for conversations that Draco was present for when his presence was required, and stayed near the edges of when it was not. Nagini moved through the rooms of the house with the particular wrongness of a creature that large existing in a domestic space, crossing the same floors that Draco had crossed as a child, and her presence in any room changed the quality of that room in ways that required management. Lucius Malfoy, released from Azkaban at some point in the early part of the final year, but stripped of most of the authority he had once held, moved through the manor with the specific wariness of someone who has made catastrophic errors and who is living in their aftermath. He was no longer the figure he had been. The confidence, the particular ease of someone whose position has always been secure, was gone. He was careful in a different way than the Malfoy family had historically been careful. Previously, they had been careful as a strategic choice, a calculation made from a position of relative security. Now Lucius was careful, because caution was the only real option available to someone who had failed the Dark Lord in a visible way, and who was still dependent on the Dark Lord's continued tolerance. Draco watched his father in the manor, and what he saw was the outcome of the Malfoy family's particular strategy. When that strategy met a situation it was not equipped to handle. His father had survived the First War by adapting. The adaptation had worked. Now the adaptation had failed because the situation had required something more than adaptation. Voldemort had demanded actual commitment, actual action, actual results, and the Malfoy family's response to those demands had been insufficient. Draco's father was the evidence of what that insufficiency cost. Draco did not have a framework for thinking past the current situation. He was 17, and he was in a household where the Dark Lord came to meetings, and where what you said in any room could be heard by people who reported to people who reported to Voldemort. He did what he had always done when the environment required careful navigation. He tried to be unremarkable. He tried to take up as little space as possible. He tried to be neither conspicuously useful nor conspicuously useless, because either extreme attracted attention. He was in the manor in February, when the Snatchers brought their prisoners through the gates. The Snatchers were groups of wizards who had organized themselves to capture people wanted by the new regime, working on bounties offered by the ministry that Voldemort now controlled through the puppet minister Piers Thickness. They had brought 3 people to the manor on the basis of identifying one of them as Hermione Granger, whose name was on the wanted list for various reasons connected to being Harry Potter's closest friend and most reliable associate. The 3 prisoners were brought into the drawing room of Malfoy Manor, which Draco had grown up in, had hosted drawing room events that marked the calendar of the Malfoy family's social life across his entire childhood. It was where guests were received. It was where important conversations happened in the sitting area near the fireplace. It was where family gatherings assembled around the long table that occupied one end of the room. He knew every inch of it. The 3 prisoners were Hermione Granger, clearly identifiable, Ron Weasley, clearly identifiable, and a young man whose face had been hit with a stinging jinx before the capture, leaving his features swollen into something that was not straightforwardly recognizable as any specific person. Bellatrix was in the house. She read Hermione immediately, and Ron immediately, and she needed the third identified, because if the third was Harry Potter, then the Dark Lord needed to be called immediately, and calling the Dark Lord in these circumstances was the end of the war. In the drawing room of Malfoy Manor that evening, she sent for Draco. He came into the room. He had been in this room thousands of times. He had sat in the chairs by the fire, and he had stood at the table, and he had received guests with his parents, and he had practiced the particular posture of a Malfoy in a drawing room that was their own, the posture of belonging completely to the space. He stood in that space now, and he looked at the 3 people in front of him, and he understood what his aunt needed from him. He looked at Ron Weasley. He said he was not sure. He looked at Hermione Granger. He said he was not sure. He looked at the young man with the swollen face. He looked for longer than either other look, long enough that the looking itself said something, though what it said depended on how carefully you were paying attention to what was in his face while he looked. He said he could not tell. These 3 responses, said in the drawing room of his family's house in front of Bellatrix and the Snatchers and his parents, kept 3 people alive. He knew. He had known all 3 of them for 6 years. He had shared corridors and classes and common spaces with them. He had played Quidditch against Harry for 6 seasons, and had sat in adjacent classrooms with Hermione through 6 years of subjects, and had argued with Ron on the Hogwarts Express in their first year. The familiarity that accumulates across that length of time does not exist only in the face. It exists in the way a person moves, the way they hold their hands, the way they occupy space in a room. Draco knew who was standing in front of him. He said he could not be sure. The choice was made in the room where he had grown up, in front of his aunt who would not forgive the wrong answer, in front of Snatchers who were waiting for payment, in front of his parents who needed the right answer, for the family standing with the Dark Lord, with everything at stake that could be at stake. He made the choice, and he said the words that made it visible, and then he was done. What followed in the drawing room after his non-identification was terrible, in a different register. Bellatrix needed information about the sword the Snatchers had taken from the prisoners, and her method of getting information from Hermione involved the Cruciatus Curse, in the hands of the person who had, across the First War and the years since, become the most proficient user of that curse in the Dark Lord's service. The sounds Hermione made were audible throughout the house. Draco was in the house. He was not in the room for all of it. He was not adding to what was happening, or extending it, or signaling his agreement with the proceedings. He was in the house while it happened, and the sounds were in the house while it happened, and the distance between being in the house and being in the room was not enormous, and was not enough. The escape happened through Dobby, the house elf who had served the Malfoy family throughout Draco's childhood, whom the family had treated with the indifference reserved for property, who had been freed in Draco's second year by a trick Harry played on Lucius, came back to the house where he had been kept, and took the prisoners out of it. He was struck by a knife thrown by Bellatrix during the disapparition, and he died of the wound on a beach. The family's house elf died, saving the people the family had been keeping prisoner. Draco had not contributed to Dobby's death. He had not thrown the knife. He was simply part of a household and a history and a situation that had produced the death, the same way he was part of a household and a history and a situation that had produced the drawing room and everything that happened in it. He could not extract himself from the situation. He could not make himself not part of it. He could only make specific choices within the situation, and the specific choice he had made was to say 3 times that he was not sure, and what that choice had meant was that Dobby had been able to come, and that the people Dobby had come for had been able to leave. The Astronomy Tower scene lasted approximately 5 minutes from the moment Draco came through the door to the moment Snape cast the killing curse. In those 5 minutes, the entire question of who Draco Malfoy was and what he was capable of was resolved in a form that left no interpretive ambiguity for anyone paying close enough attention. The resolution was not the one Voldemort had designed the task to produce. It was not the resolution of a young Death Eater completing his first major assignment and proving his worth to the cause. It was the resolution of someone discovering, in the moment of maximum pressure, the precise and irreducible location of the limit of what they could do. Draco had known, at some level, that the limit existed. The bathroom had been one expression of that knowing. The months of deterioration had been another. The fact that he had been working on the cabinet, which could be worked on, rather than working on the assassination, which could not be worked on in any preparation sense, was a third. He had spent the year working around the actual task by doing the preparatory work for the actual task, because the preparatory work was achievable and the actual task was not. This was not a conscious strategy. It was what happened when someone who could not do a specific thing was required to organize their activities around that specific thing. What Dumbledore offered him on the tower was not just the protection of himself and his mother. Dumbledore was also offering him a way of understanding himself that did not require him to be a failed Death Eater. Dumbledore's "you are not a killer" was not a condemnation. It was an accurate description of someone who had never been what the circumstances were treating him as being. You are not this thing that you have been asked to be. You never were. The task was given to you by someone who knew it was beyond you, as a punishment. The tower is not a failure of your commitment. It is a recognition of your actual nature. Whether Draco fully processed this in the moment is questionable. He was 16, and he was standing on a tower, and he was crying, and the Death Eaters were about to come through the door. The conditions for careful reflection were not present. What was present was the offer, and his arm dropping a few more degrees in response to the offer, and then the Death Eaters arriving, and the moment being over. Snape's arrival and the killing curse ended the scene in a way that resolved the practical question without resolving the deeper one. Dumbledore was dead. The task was done. The school would know within hours that the headmaster had been killed. The war had moved to a new phase. All of this was true, and also irrelevant to the specific question of what had happened to Draco in the moment between the door opening the first time and the door opening the second time. What had happened was that Draco had stood with a wand in his hand and his arm shaking and his face wet, and he had not fired. He had not fired because the thing that would have allowed him to fire was not in him. Not because he was afraid, though he was afraid. Not because he had been persuaded by Dumbledore's offer, though the offer had landed, because the thing itself was not there. This is different from reluctance. Reluctance can be overcome by pressure or by the right circumstances. What was not in Draco was not reluctance. It was the capacity. The thing required for the arm to stay up and the wand to fire was not present, and no amount of pressure or circumstance or preparation had been able to install it, because it was not the kind of thing that preparation could install. That was the 5 minutes on the Astronomy Tower. The rest of it, the death and the running and the summer and the return and the manor and everything that followed, was the consequence of those 5 minutes, extended across the remaining period of the war. When Draco was in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor in the late winter of the 7th year, looking at the 3 prisoners the Snatchers had brought, the experience of the tower was present in the room with him, even if he was not consciously drawing on it. He had already been through the moment where the gap between his performance and his capacity had been made completely visible, to himself and to Dumbledore and to the Death Eaters who had been present. He had already been the person who could not complete the task. He was already that person. He had been that person before the tower, but the tower had confirmed it in a way that could not be disputed. In the drawing room, when he said 3 times that he was not sure, he was being consistent. He was being the person he had already been revealed to be. The 3 words in the drawing room were not a departure from who he had been in the previous 7 years. They were a continuation of who he had been in the previous 7 years. The person who consistently could not bring himself to be the direct and personal cause of irreversible harm to someone standing in front of him. The drawing room was the tower again, at a lower register, with different people watching and different consequences attached. He said the 3 words, and the 3 words meant the same thing as the arm dropping on the tower. I cannot do this specific thing. I cannot be the direct cause of this. I cannot perform the action that confirms the harm. 3 words. The most important 3 words Draco Malfoy ever spoke. Said in the drawing room where he had grown up, in front of his aunt and the Snatchers and his parents, with everything at stake that could be at stake. Said without drama, without visible anguish, without the kind of performance that would have drawn attention to the decision being made. Said, and then done, and then the conversation moved on to other things, and the 3 people in front of him stayed alive long enough for Dobby to come. Narcissa's moment in the Forbidden Forest deserves its own attention, because it is the moment that makes everything about Draco's story legible in retrospect. In the early hours of the morning that ended the Battle of Hogwarts, Harry Potter walked into the Forbidden Forest, carrying the Resurrection Stone, having accepted that he had to die, that his death was required for Voldemort to be defeated, that the fragment of Voldemort's soul living inside him needed to be destroyed, and that the only way to destroy it was for Voldemort to cast the killing curse at him. He was 17 years old. He walked into the forest, and he stopped in a clearing, and Voldemort cast the curse. Harry did not die in the way the situation appeared to require. The fragment of Voldemort's soul in him was destroyed. Harry himself survived, because the circumstances surrounding what Voldemort had done with his blood years earlier created a protection that neither of them had understood. Harry lay on the forest floor, in a state between life and death, and Voldemort, believing he had succeeded, needed to know. He sent Narcissa Malfoy to check. Narcissa walked to where Harry lay, and she knelt beside him, and she put her hand on his chest, and she leaned close to his face, and she asked him, in a whisper, whether Draco was alive, whether Draco was still in the castle, whether her son was still alive in the building behind them. Harry said yes. Narcissa stood up and told Voldemort that Harry Potter was dead. He was not dead. She had known he was not dead when she put her hand on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat. She could feel him breathing. She had assessed him at close range, woman to boy on the forest floor, and she had known he was alive, and she had stood up and told the most dangerous dark wizard in a century that he was dead. She had told this lie directly to Voldemort's face, in front of his assembled Death Eaters, in a clearing in a forest in the early morning of the most important day of the war, with her husband and her sister, and everyone else watching. She lied because Draco was alive in the castle. She lied because getting inside the castle and finding her son was the thing she needed to do, and the only way to get inside the castle was to tell Voldemort that the boy on the forest floor was dead, so that the procession back to the school could begin, so that she could walk into Hogwarts and find her son in the chaos that followed. She lied to Voldemort. This is the thing that is easy to say and difficult to fully understand. Bellatrix, her sister, was standing in the same clearing. Bellatrix, who had devoted her life to Voldemort's cause, who had gone to Azkaban for it, who had tortured people on his behalf with complete conviction. Bellatrix was in the clearing watching, and Narcissa stood in front of Bellatrix and Voldemort and all of his assembled Death Eaters, and told the lie that she needed to tell, and she told it without visible hesitation, because Draco was in the castle, because her son was what mattered, because the cause that Bellatrix had given everything to was not the organizing principle of Narcissa's life in the way it was Bellatrix's. The organizing principle of Narcissa's life was her son, and her son was in the castle, and the lie was what was required. This is the moment that makes Draco's story fully legible. Draco could not fire the killing curse at Dumbledore, because Dumbledore was a specific person standing in front of him, and the thing required to fire the curse was not present in him. Narcissa could not let Harry Potter die on the forest floor, because Harry Potter had just told her that Draco was alive, and with that confirmation, the reason for the lie existed, and she told it. Both of them were acting from love for the same person, in two different moments, in two different parts of the same war. Draco's love for his mother was why he could not close the gap on the tower. Narcissa's love for Draco was why she could lie to Voldemort's face in the forest without flinching. This is what the Malfoy family's story was actually about, not the ideology, not the pure-blood belief system that organized its self-presentation across several centuries, not even the political calculations that had gotten Lucius in and out of more trouble than most wizards encountered in a lifetime. What it was actually about was the love between a mother and her son, and the way that love consistently overrode everything else, when everything else came into direct conflict with it. Draco understood this, at whatever level a person understands the organizing principles of their emotional life before they have language for them. He had grown up inside his mother's love, and the love had shaped him before he was old enough to be shaped by anything else. The ideology had been laid over the love, packaged with it, delivered in the same rooms and by the same person, but the love was deeper and earlier and more genuinely his than the ideology had ever been. When Dumbledore offered him protection for his mother on the tower, the offer reached into the thing that was actually there, the actual Draco underneath the performance. The arm came down because the arm was being held up by the performance, and the performance could not hold against the real thing, which was the possibility of his mother being protected. The forest scene, which happened months later, and which Draco was not present for, was the other side of the same moment. His mother was protected. She protected him. She lied to Voldemort so that she could walk into the castle and find her son. And the lie worked, because Voldemort, who did not understand love, had not built any defense against the possibility that someone would choose their child over him in the middle of his moment of apparent victory. This was the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Voldemort's understanding of the Malfoy family. He had thought he understood what they were. He had thought they were sufficiently pragmatic, sufficiently motivated by self-interest and status and the ideology of blood purity, that he could use them by threatening the things they cared about. He had given Draco the impossible task, because threatening Draco was the most effective way to threaten Lucius, and threatening Lucius was a useful lesson for all the other Death Eaters watching. What he had not accounted for was the specific love between Narcissa and Draco, which was not a pragmatic calculation and was not organized around status or ideology. It was simply there, the way love is simply there when it is genuinely present, and it was not susceptible to the kind of manipulation that the Dark Lord's approach to human motivation depended on. The Malfoy family survived the war because of the specific love that the Dark Lord had not accounted for, not because of their ideology, or their money, or their family connections, or any of the things that the Malfoy family had historically used to secure their position, because Narcissa lied to Voldemort's face in a forest clearing, in the early morning of the last day of the war. This is the ending of the story, not redemption in the conventional sense, not the revelation that the Malfoys were secretly good all along, but the revelation that what the Malfoy family actually contained, underneath the ideology and the performance and the centuries of calculated positioning, was a love that was real enough to lie to the most dangerous wizard of the century for the sake of reaching a specific person in a specific building. Draco carried this forward. He raised Scorpius with the love and without the ideology, which was not the same as raising him with no history or no complexity. Scorpius grew up in a household full of history and complexity. He grew up knowing his family's name and what it had meant and what it had been associated with. He grew up understanding, at whatever age that understanding becomes possible, that the people who had raised him had been on the wrong side of something important and had survived being on the wrong side in ways that were not simple. And he grew up, despite all of that, warm and curious, and willing to form genuine connections across the lines his grandfather had tried to make permanent. He grew up able to be himself, whatever that turned out to be, in ways that the previous generation's Malfoys had not been permitted by the world they had built around themselves. The name Malfoy continued, the history continued. The manor stood in Wiltshire, and the portraits looked down from the walls, and the books remained on the shelves, and the weight of everything that had happened was present in the building and in the air of the rooms. But Scorpius Malfoy moved through those rooms as a person rather than as a Malfoy in the specific sense that his grandfather had required, and this was different, and the difference had started on a tower in June when a 16-year-old's arm had come down by degrees. That is the story. The wand that shook and came down. The arm that lowered across the whole length of the Hogwarts years, 1 degree at a time, in the Forbidden Forest, and in the corridors, and in the bathroom, and on the Astronomy Tower, and in the drawing room of the manor. The gap that never closed, across 7 years, and every circumstance that tested it. He was never going to follow through, not because of virtue or moral conviction or secret goodness, because the thing that would have been required was not there, and had never been there, and no amount of preparation or pressure or inheritance could install it in the person it was not already in. The gap was the person survived. The battle came to Hogwarts in the night of May, in the final year of the war. Voldemort's forces surrounded the school, those inside prepared to fight. The battle began in the hours after midnight, and ran through the night and into the morning, moving through the rooms and corridors of a castle that had spent 11 centuries accumulating the history of every witch and wizard who had studied there, and was now accumulating the history of a final confrontation between the forces that had been building toward each other since before any of the people fighting in it were born. The Room of Requirement was active in the middle of this, in its form as the Room of Hidden Things, the immense storage space where a millennium of Hogwarts students had placed objects they needed to conceal. The room in this configuration was vast, much larger than the room as it appeared in any of its other forms, its ceiling lost in the stacks of abandoned and forgotten things that filled it from floor to somewhere above where any lantern could reach. Harry needed to be in it for something connected to the Horcrux hunt that had been the secret project of his year. Draco came into the room with Crabbe and Goyle. He came armed, and with intent, and with a purpose that was given to him, or assumed by him, in the context of what the night required. He came looking for Harry, or looking for whatever Harry was looking for, or simply because someone had told him to look there, and being told where to go, and going there was a posture he had occupied for the entire year. He came in with 2 people who had been at his side for 7 years, and who were, in the final year of the war, different from what they had been. Crabbe had been radicalized by the year, in ways that Draco had not. The world the Dark Lord had built, the world of the Carrows teaching the dark arts as an active practice rather than a subject to be studied against, the world where cruelty had institutional endorsement, and where a certain kind of violence was rewarded, had done something to Crabbe that it had not done to Draco. Draco had spent the year trying to be invisible. Crabbe had spent the year becoming someone with genuine investment in the violence, someone who had arrived at the place where the act was the point, rather than a means to something else. Crabbe unleashed fiend fire. The cursed fire was one of the most dangerous forms of magic that existed in the known inventory of dark spells. A living flame that moved with intent, and that consumed everything, and that could not be extinguished by ordinary counterspells, and that, once released, required specific and difficult magic to control, that Crabbe did not have, and had not thought he would need. He released it because releasing it was what he wanted to do, and because he was in the Room of Hidden Things, with no adult authority present to stop him. The fire took the room almost immediately. It spread through the stacked centuries of abandoned objects with the speed that comes from having more fuel than any ordinary fire could hope for, catching the furniture and the papers and the wood and the cloth, and moving upward and outward. The heat was enormous and immediate, and the smoke was heavy, and the room that had been vast and explorable became something you could not navigate on foot in a matter of seconds. Draco's first visible response was to tell Crabbe to stop, not to attack Harry, who was also in the room looking for his own reasons, and who was now also trapped by the fire Crabbe had started, not to use the chaos as cover for whatever purpose had brought Draco into the room in the first place. Stop Crabbe. Get him to stop what he had started, because the fire was going to kill everyone in the room, regardless of which side they were on, and regardless of what any of them had come in to do. Crabbe could not be stopped, and could not stop it himself. The fire was beyond the control of the person who had released it. Crabbe died in it, taken by what he had created, unable to outrun or dismiss what he had called up. Goyle was pulled to safety by Ron. Draco was trapped on a piece of broken furniture, surrounded on 3 sides by cursed fire, and on the 4th by more cursed fire that was not yet quite as close. Harry came back. He had gotten out. He had been on a broomstick, had found his way through the smoke and the heat to the door, had been outside the room with the exit visible and his friends beside him. He came back in through the smoke because Draco was in there, and Draco was going to die if nobody came back for him. He came back in the same way he had always come back, because the alternative was leaving someone to die, and he did not do that. Not even someone who had spent 6 years as his enemy, not even someone who had tried to give him to Voldemort by non-identifying him in a drawing room several months before. He reached Draco on the broomstick through the burning air. Draco took the hand that was extended to him. They came out of the room of requirement together, out of the cursed fire, into the corridor of Hogwarts where the battle was still happening around them, and the room collapsed behind them as the fire found the walls and the ceiling. The battle moved through the castle, and out onto the grounds and into the forest, and then back into the Great Hall, and it ended in the way it ended, with Harry dying and coming back, and Voldemort dying for good in the castle's courtyard, and the magical world arriving at the morning of the day after the war was over. The Malfoy family had not fought on either side. Lucius and Narcissa had spent the evening searching for Draco in the castle, finding him, and leaving the fighting to the people who had chosen to fight. They sat in the Great Hall in the aftermath, in the terrible quiet that fell over the space after the last spells had been cast, not clearly on the side of those who had fought for the school, and not clearly on the side of those who had fought against it. They were simply there, present, alive. The trials that followed in the Wizarding World's restructuring dealt with the Malfoy family in a way that was shaped partly by what Harry Potter said, in the spaces where his account of events mattered. He confirmed that Draco had not identified him at Malfoy Manor. He confirmed that he had pulled Draco from the room of requirement. He provided the account of the Astronomy Tower that placed Draco's actions in the context of what Draco had not been able to do, rather than what he had technically been part of organizing. These facts did not transform the Malfoys into heroes of the war. The alignment with Voldemort was real, and had cost people who were not Malfoys real harm across the years it persisted. But the distinction between committed participation and failed participation was present in the record, and the trials worked with what the record showed. The Malfoys were not sent to Azkaban. They remained in Wizarding Society in a diminished position that was the appropriate consequence of what the record showed, and nothing more than that. The name Malfoy was associated with the wrong side of the war in ways that would not stop being true or stop mattering during the years that followed. Lucius did not return to the ministry, or to any of the public roles that had once organized his sense of his own importance. Narcissa maintained the household and its appearance with the same competence she had always applied to the surface of the Malfoy family's life. Draco was in his late teens, and the world was rebuilding around him. He married Astoria Greengrass in the years after the war. She had been a student at Hogwarts during the same years as Draco, a year behind him, from a family whose pure-blood standing matched the standards the Malfoy household would have recognized as appropriate. She had the beliefs she had been raised to hold, as Draco had, absorbed from the atmosphere of a household that treated those beliefs as simply how things were. Then she had contracted a blood curse. The specifics of the curse were the kind that moved through pure-blood families, whose practices of selection had narrowed the genetic variability of their lines across many generations. It was a disease that could not be cured, only managed, and managing it required time and attention, and a particular kind of engagement with the reality of your own mortality that most people in their 20s did not have the occasion to develop. The illness had changed the way Astoria saw the world she had been raised in, not all at once, not in a single moment of clarity, but across the months and then the years of managing a condition that was not going to get better, and that was shortening the time available to her. The ideology that organized people by the particularity of their bloodlines had a different quality when you were living in a body whose difficulties were partly caused by the practices those ideologies prescribed. She had looked at the beliefs she had inherited, and she had decided, in the specific way of someone who has had occasion to think carefully about what they actually believe, that she did not believe them. She did not want to raise children with them. Draco did not argue. The man who had once distributed badges saying Potter stinks through the corridors of Hogwarts, who had called Hermione Granger a mudblood in a Quidditch field, who had spent 9 months repairing a vanishing cabinet in service of a plan to assassinate the headmaster, who had stood on a tower with a shaking arm and been unable to fire, sat with his wife and did not argue with her about how to raise their son. Whatever internal process had produced the absence of argument is not something he articulated publicly in any account that has survived. The absence itself is what is visible. Their son was named Scorpius. He was born into the manor in Wiltshire, into the rooms with the dark portraits and the heavy furniture. and the accumulated objects of several centuries of Malfoy history. He grew up inside the weight of a name that the war had made infamous in specific and indelible ways. He learned about his family's history the way children learn about the things their families did, through accounts that were incomplete and complicated, and that did not yield to simple summaries. What Scorpius Malfoy became, by all accounts of those who encountered him as a child and then as a student at Hogwarts, was warm and curious and genuinely interested in other people, in ways that his grandfather would not have recognized as appropriate Malfoy behavior. He was kind to people who other students, given the history, might have expected him to regard with the disdain his grandfather had practiced. He formed friendships across lines that his grandfather had tried to make permanent, and his father had inherited without examining, and that his mother had decided to not pass on. He carried the name Malfoy with a different quality than the name had previously been carried, as though no one had told him he was supposed to carry it in a particular way, as though the particular way was simply not available to him as an option. This was Draco's contribution to the world after the war, a son who grew up in a house full of heavy history and who was lighter than the history should have allowed. Not because Draco was comprehensively good, or because the war had transformed him into someone different from who he had been, because he had made one specific and fundamental choice, which was to not pass on to his son the inherited certainty about other people's worth that had organized the Malfoy household across the generations he had grown up inside. The ideology had always been secondary to the family. This was the Malfoy family's actual principle, visible if you looked across the generations at what the family had actually prioritized when ideology and family interest came into conflict. The ideology served the family's position when it served it, and was set aside when it did not. What was never set aside was the family itself. Lucius had served Voldemort, and then claimed he had been coerced because the coercion story allowed the family to survive. Narcissa had made Snape take the vow because her son's survival was not something she was willing to leave to the ideology's requirements. Draco had said he was not sure in the drawing room, because the specific act of positive identification was one he could not bring himself to perform when the person in front of him was someone he knew. Each of these was a version of the same prioritization, the family, and the people in it, above the cause. The cause had always been a tool the family used. What had changed across the generations, across the specific crucible of the Second War, and what it had cost, and what it had revealed, was that Draco had ended up in a position to pass something forward to his own son that was different from what had been passed to him. He passed forward the priority of the family, which was real, and the love for the people in it, which was real. He left out the ideology that had been attached to both of those things in the previous generation, the specific certainty about bloodlines and hierarchies, and who deserved what from the world. He left it out because the war had shown him what it cost when the ideology was fully expressed in the world, and the cost was something he was not willing to pass on to his son, even if he had not fully articulated to himself why. Astoria died while Scorpius was still young. The blood curse took her earlier than anyone had hoped. Draco raised his son in the manor after that, in the rooms where the war had happened, and where the history was present in the walls, and the portraits and the objects, and he got through the loss and the daily requirements of a life that still needed to be lived, the way people get through things that are too large to process while they are being experienced, by continuing. Scorpius went to Hogwarts and came back in the holidays, and grew up, and the name Malfoy continued to exist in the world, with the specific person who now carried it, who was not what the name had once implied, who was simply himself. The Malfoys survived. This had always been what they did best. To understand all of the signs across 7 years, to understand what the Astronomy Tower was actually evidence of, and what the drawing room at the manor was actually evidence of, and what the Forbidden Forest screaming in his first year was evidence of, you have to understand one thing clearly. Draco Malfoy was never going to follow through. Not because he was secretly good, not because the ideology was foreign to him and he had always been fighting it internally, not because of a hidden nobility that would have emerged cleanly if circumstances had been different. The picture is too complicated and too human for any of those clean readings. He was never going to follow through, because the thing that would have required him to follow through, the thing that genuine commitment to the cause would have required, was a willingness to harm specific people standing directly in front of him, people whose faces he knew, in ways that could not be undone. And Draco Malfoy, across 7 years of every opportunity, that could have tested this, consistently could not do it. He could harm people through language and proxy and borrowed authority and theatrical performance. He could not harm them at the level where the harm was personal and direct and final and required something to be present inside him that was not present. This was not something that preparation could install. 9 months of cabinet repair could not put it there. 6 years of Slytherin could not put it there. The inherited ideology could not put it there, because it was not a matter of ideology. It was a matter of what Draco was actually capable of, at the specific, concrete, irreducible level of what happened, when the moment required it, and the moment was actually there. He was not a killer. Dumbledore had named this correctly, and the signs that this was true had been present from the very beginning. If this story has found you somewhere comfortable tonight, and you are drifting toward rest, please subscribe to the channel before you close your eyes. A like on this video takes only a moment and helps more than you might expect. New episodes arrive regularly, and the playlist holds more whenever you want to return. Sleep well tonight. The story of Draco Malfoy is sometimes told as a redemption arc, the story of someone who started out on the wrong side and gradually moved toward the right one. That framing is too clean and misses the actual truth, which is more honest and more interesting. Draco did not start out bad and become better through moral development and personal growth. He started out in a household that had handed him a set of beliefs and a performance of those beliefs before he was old enough to evaluate them, and he spent 7 years discovering that the performance could not survive contact with what the beliefs actually required when expressed as action rather than atmosphere. He did not choose to be unable to follow through. He was unable to follow through, and the inability was the most important fact about him, and the inability showed itself across every year at Hogwarts, in signs that were visible in the specific architecture of how he behaved in any situation where something was actually at stake. He screamed in the Forbidden Forest and left Harry alone in the clearing because the forest was genuinely frightening, and the performance of toughness could not hold against genuine fright. He borrowed his father's name in every conflict because personal action in conflicts, where the outcome was uncertain, was not something his inventory contained. He called Hermione Granger a mudblood in a Quidditch field because the word was the most effective available instrument, and the context was low enough stakes that the gap between the word and actual harm was invisible. He let Death Eaters into the castle, but could not fire the final curse, because letting them in was mechanical preparation, and firing the curse was something else entirely. He said he could not be sure in the drawing room, because confirming the identification would have required him to be the direct cause of a death, in a way that the preceding 6 years had consistently demonstrated he was not able to be. The gap between his performance and his capacity was structural. It was the result of growing up in a household that modeled the performance of certain qualities without modeling the actual possession of them, that taught its children to project confidence and superiority and conviction without ensuring that anything was there to back the projection up when circumstances required it to be backed up. The gap was present from the beginning. The first 7 years of his life at Hogwarts were spent discovering how large the gap was and how consistently it showed up whenever the performance met something that the performance alone could not handle. He survived this discovery. He survived it because Narcissa had made Snape take the unbreakable vow, and because Dumbledore had made his own arrangements for the night on the tower, and because Harry Potter had a pattern of coming back for people rather than leaving them, even people he had very good reasons to leave. He survived because the war produced a situation where his specific incapacity, his inability to close the gap between performance and the act, turned out to be protective in ways that genuine commitment to the Dark Lord's cause would not have been. The committed Death Eaters went to Azkaban. Draco was too unreliable to have earned that commitment, and therefore too unreliable to bear its full consequences. He was, in the end, what he had always been. Someone who had inherited a world and a set of tools for navigating it, and who had found, when the navigation required something the tools could not provide, that the tools were what they were, and he was what he was. And the gap between those two things was not something that could be willed closed by a 16-year-old standing on a tower in June with a shaking arm. The wand came down by degrees, across the whole length of his Hogwarts years. On the Astronomy Tower, it completed the movement it had been making all along. The arm that had been shaking for 9 months and for 7 years dropped to his side, and was simply an arm, belonging to a boy who was not a killer, who had never been a killer, who had stood at the edge of the thing the world had been trying to make him, and had found, in the specific gap between the world's requirements and his actual nature, that he was something else entirely. Something smaller and more ordinary, and, perhaps, more durable than what the role he had been cast in required. His son grew up in the manor in Wiltshire, and he was warm, and he was curious, and he formed friendships, and he carried the name Malfoy, as though it were simply his name, not a statement of ideology, or a claim to superiority, or a badge of a particular position in a hierarchy the war had made obsolete. He grew up, and in growing up he was the evidence that the particular chain of events that had made his father stand on a tower with a shaking arm had not left the Malfoy line entirely as it had found it. The stars over Hogwarts were clear the night it happened. The castle was lit, and the battle was moving through its ancient rooms, and at the top of the Astronomy Tower, a boy who was not a killer stood with his arm shaking and his face wet, and the proof of it visible in every degree the arm came down. He could not close the gap. He never could have. The night is quiet now. The story is finished. Rest well. The nature of what Draco actually felt about his family's cause is a question that is harder to answer than it appears, and the difficulty is worth sitting with, rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. He was not secretly on the right side all along. That reading flatters him in ways the record does not support, and does a disservice to the people who actually made meaningful choices to resist Voldemort at real personal cost. The people in the Order of the Phoenix, the people who hid Muggle-born wizards, the people who fought at the Ministry and at Hogwarts, were doing something different from, and more courageous than what Draco was doing during the same period. He was not one of them. He was never one of them. He was also not a true believer, in the way that Bellatrix was a true believer. This reading is also wrong, and it is wrong in a specific and important way. Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort was real in the sense that she acted on it consistently and at great personal cost across many years, including imprisonment in Azkaban and the kinds of violence she perpetrated in his name. The devotion drove her actions in a way that was not performance. Draco's alignment with Voldemort never drove his actions in that way. His alignment with Voldemort was performed in contexts where performing it was advantageous, or at least not dangerous, and it consistently failed to produce action in contexts where acting on it would have cost him something real. What Draco actually held was something more complicated and more human than either of these simple readings. Inherited beliefs that he had absorbed before he could evaluate them, which he wore as social identity in contexts where wearing them was safe, which he used as weapons in social conflicts where they were effective, which he could not perform into the genuine conviction required when the beliefs were supposed to produce real action at real cost. The inherited beliefs were not nothing. They were genuinely his, in the sense that they had been placed in him before he had the capacity to question them. He had grown up inside them, the way he had grown up inside the manor, the way you grow up inside anything that was there, before you had the resources to choose whether to be inside it. They organized his worldview and his social behavior and his understanding of himself and his family's place in the wizarding world. They were real beliefs in his life, even though they had been handed to him rather than arrived at through examination. But they were not deep enough to survive the specific test that the war applied to them. The test the war applied was, here is someone you know, standing in front of you, and the thing you claim to believe tells you to harm them, to confirm their capture to people who will kill them, to fire the curse that ends them. Do you believe it enough to do that? And Draco, across every instance of this test in his 6 and 7 years at Hogwarts, consistently answered in the negative, not through speech, usually, through the absence of action, through the arm that did not fire, through the 3 words that did not confirm. This does not make him a good person by any straightforward measure. He called people mudbloods, and he used his family's connections to cause real harm to Hagrid and Buckbeak, and he distributed badges, and he helped Umbridge catch students who were trying to resist a regime that was suppressing the truth about the return of the most dangerous dark wizard of the century. The harm he caused, through the tools he was comfortable using, was real harm that real people experienced. What it makes him is a complicated person who inherited something he was not equipped to carry to its conclusions, who wore that inheritance through the years of a school life that did not test its conclusions directly, and who failed to complete the conclusions when the testing finally arrived. The failure was not moral growth. It was the revelation of a limit that had always been there. After the war, the question of what to do with that limit, what to build in the space where the ideology had been, was one Draco worked on in the quiet way of someone who does not have dramatic conversions, but who makes specific choices in specific moments that accumulate across years into something different from what was there before. Marrying Astoria was one of those choices. Not choosing to argue with her about raising Scorpius was another. Whatever conversations he had with his son about the war and the family's history and what it meant were additional ones. Whether he told Scorpius the full account of the tower, of the drawing room, of the specific moments where the gap between performance and capacity had been visible, is not recorded. What is recorded is the person Scorpius became. Scorpius became someone who formed genuine friendships without the social map that had organized his grandfather's relationships. He became someone who was curious about people outside the categories the ideology would have organized. He became someone for whom the name Malfoy was simply his name, a historical weight he carried but was not governed by. This did not happen automatically. It happened because someone made specific choices about what to hand forward and what to not hand forward, and the choices accumulated into a different person than the choices that had produced Draco. The cycles that define wizarding family history, the way beliefs and practices and ideologies pass through generations, can go in multiple directions. They can reinforce and intensify across generations, which is what had happened with the ideology in the Malfoy and Black family lines across many decades. Or they can diminish when someone in the chain makes enough specific choices in enough specific moments that what passes forward is different from what was received. Draco was not consciously engineering an interruption of his family's ideological inheritance. He was making specific choices in specific moments that, in aggregate, produced an interruption. The specific choices were things like not arguing with Astoria, sending Scorpius to Hogwarts without the specific instructions about who deserved the family's respect, not, apparently, using the language of the Manor's drawing room conversations in the presence of his growing son. These were small choices that cost him little individually and that accumulated across years into something significant. The war had cost the Malfoy family most of what it had historically used to measure its own worth: the social standing, the ministry connections, the general respect of the community it had occupied. What remained after the war was the manor and the name and the history and the people. It is possible that what remained was enough, and that the stripping away of the social apparatus was what created the space for the specific choices that Draco made in the years that followed. Or it is possible that Narcissa's love, which had always been the realest thing in the family, was simply what eventually won out over everything else the household contained. The love that had made her take Snape's unbreakable vow, the love that had made her lie to Voldemort's face in the Forbidden Forest when Scorpius was what she needed to reach, the love that had organized Draco's understanding of what mattered most, even when he could not have articulated the organization. He gave his son what his mother had given him, a world organized around a specific love. He left out the ideology that his mother had attached to that love. He passed forward the love and let the ideology go, which is perhaps the most important thing a Malfoy had done in many generations. The question of what Draco Malfoy's story means in the larger context of the war and the wizarding world it transformed is one that deserves more than a simple answer, because the simple answers are all wrong in specific ways. The simple answer that positions him as a villain who partially reformed misses the fact that the character of what he was had not changed across the years. He was the same person in his first year that he was in his seventh, in all the ways that mattered for understanding what he was actually capable of. The reform narrative implies that something changed, that he became better, that the arc of his development pointed somewhere different from where he started. But the Draco who could not fire on the Astronomy Tower in June of his 6th year was the same Draco who had screamed in the Forbidden Forest in his first year. The capacity for genuine violence directed at specific people standing in front of him had been absent from the beginning. It was absent at the end. The simple answer that positions him as a hero who was misunderstood misses the real harm he caused through the years, and the real choices he made towards specific people who did not deserve the treatment he gave them. Hermione Granger was hurt by the slur in the Quidditch field. Neville Longbottom's already difficult school experience was made more difficult by 5 years of consistent social aggression from Draco and his companions. Hagrid's position at the school was complicated by the Buckbeak incident and the campaign Draco ran through his father to get the animal executed. These were real harms experienced by real people, and the fact that Draco could not bring himself to fire the killing curse does not undo them. The honest answer is that Draco was someone who fell short of what the world he was born into required, and that falling short, in the specific war the wizarding world was fighting, turned out to be the right thing in ways he had not planned and could not have anticipated. He fell short because of what he was made of, not because of what he chose to be. He did not choose his own incapacity. He did not engineer his inability to follow through as a strategic act of resistance. He simply could not do the specific things that being a genuine Death Eater required, not because of moral objection, but because of personal limitation, and the personal limitation turned out to have consequences that were better than the alternative. This is an uncomfortable conclusion, because it does not allow for a clean moral ledger. Draco did not earn the outcomes he got. He did not suffer in proportion to what he contributed to causing. He was present in a household where prisoners were kept, and where torture happened, and where the machinery of Voldemort's occupation of Wizarding Britain was operated, and he was present without being a heroic resister, and without doing anything that would have cost him significantly. He simply was not quite bad enough to be held fully accountable in the way that the fully committed were held accountable. The trials recognized this. The legal system, operating with the specific evidence available, distinguished between committed participation and failed participation, and arrived at consequences that matched the distinction. Whether those consequences were proportionate to the full scope of what the Malfoy family had been involved with across both wars is a question that admits of reasonable disagreement. What the law could prove was what the record showed, and the record showed a family that had been on the wrong side and had failed to be as wrong as the wrong side required. For Draco, the years after the war were years of living in the aftermath of a position he had not fully earned and outcomes he had not fully planned. He was free when many people with less family wealth and worse legal representation were in Azkaban for comparable involvement. He lived in the manor in Wiltshire when other pureblood families who had made similar choices had lost their properties and their standing. He had the resources, in money and space and time, to do what he did with them, which was to raise his son differently. The raising of Scorpius differently was not compensation for what the Malfoy family had been. It was not redemption in the accounting sense. It was simply what Draco chose to do in the specific circumstances of his life after the war, with the specific person who was his wife telling him what she thought about blood purity ideology, and the specific person who was his son growing up in front of him. He did not make grand gestures toward reconciliation or apology. He made small choices, repeatedly, that produced a different generation. Scorpius Malfoy arrived at Hogwarts as someone who had been told the full truth about his family's history, or as much of the truth as Draco was able to tell. He arrived knowing that the name he carried had been associated with Voldemort's cause, and that people would treat him accordingly. He arrived knowing that his grandfather had been a Death Eater, and that his father had been given an assignment in his 6th year that he had not completed. He arrived with that knowledge, and he formed friendships, and he was curious about people, and he was, by all accounts, someone that the previous generation's Malfoys would not have recognized as a Malfoy at all. This is what several years of small choices accumulated into. Not a perfect outcome, not a clean resolution, simply a different person in the next generation, carrying the name with different weight, shaped by a father who had been given the worst inheritance the wizarding world had to offer, and who had, in failing to live up to that inheritance, left room for something else to grow. The gap that had been present in Draco from the beginning, the gap between his performance and his capacity, the gap that had been visible in the Forbidden Forest and in the corridors, and in the bathroom, and on the tower, and in the drawing room, turned out to be the space where Scorpius could exist. The gap was not a moral achievement, it was a personal fact about who Draco was, but the gap was there, and the gap meant that the chain of the ideology did not pass forward unbroken, and what passed instead was something lighter and smaller and more genuinely human than what had been passed to Draco. He was never going to follow through. This was true from the beginning, and it was true on the tower, and it was true in the drawing room, and it was true in the room of requirement, and it is true as the summary of his 7 years at Hogwarts, and the years that followed. The wand came down by degrees across the whole length of his life. The arm that had been raised against specific people and had consistently failed to fire had, by the time Scorpius was born, simply settled into the ordinary position of someone living an ordinary life in a house with a complicated history. Ordinary. After all of it, ordinary. Not redeemed in the heroic sense, not transformed by a moment of moral clarity, simply someone who had arrived at the other side of an impossible situation and who was, in the end, just a person. The person he was had always been this, someone who loved his family more than he believed in anything else. Someone who was afraid of the dark and ran from it in his first year and spent the rest of his Hogwarts life trying to build armor strong enough that nobody could see the running. Someone who could be cruel through language and proxy and borrowed authority, and who could not be cruel in the direct and final way the war required. Someone whose mother's love had been the realest thing in his world, and who had, in the end, organized his own parenting around a version of that love, stripped of the ideology that had been attached to it. He lived in the manor, in Wiltshire, in the rooms where the portraits looked down from the walls, and the history was present in every object and every angle of the ceilings. He got older. His son grew up and went to Hogwarts and came back in the holidays and became a person Draco was proud of, in ways that had nothing to do with what the Malfoy family had historically been proud of. He carried on. The stars over Hogwarts on the night of the Astronomy Tower were clear and still. The castle was lit, and the battle was in its corridors, and at the top of the highest tower, a boy with a shaking arm stood between what the world required of him and what he actually was. He could not close the distance. He had never been able to close it. He was not a killer. He had never been a killer. And in being exactly what he was, nothing more and nothing less, he had inadvertently done more for the future than the performance he had spent 7 years maintaining had ever been capable of producing. Sleep now. The story of Draco Malfoy is finished. The night is long and quiet, and there is nothing left to know. The Hogwarts that Draco attended across those 7 years was a place where the values that organized his world were consistently at odds with the values the school was supposed to be transmitting. Hogwarts was, in theory, a place where talent mattered more than ancestry, where what you could do with magic was more important than who your family was, where the 4 houses accommodated different qualities without implying that the qualities of one were worth more than the qualities of another. In practice, the house system had its own hierarchies and its own social politics, but the school's official values were as Dumbledore had always insisted they were, inclusive and talent-focused and resistant to the ideology of blood purity. Draco had grown up in a household where those values were considered a dangerous corruption of what the wizarding world should be, and he arrived at Hogwarts performing the critique of those values that his household had prepared him with. He sneered at the Muggle studies curriculum. He positioned the ideology of blood purity as obviously correct in the specific social context of Slytherin House, where the corridor of opinion ran in directions that made the performance feel natural. He presented himself as someone whose understanding of the wizarding world was superior to Dumbledore's inclusive vision, because his family had told him that Dumbledore's vision was a kind of weakness, and that the people who were willing to call it what it was were the people worth being. But something happened across the 7 years that had nothing to do with ideology. He lived with people. He sat in classrooms with them. He ate meals at the next table from them. He watched them study and play Quidditch and argue with teachers and take examinations. He observed, whether he wanted to or not, that the people his ideology was supposed to allow him to look down on were people, that Hermione Granger was brilliant and capable, and that her brilliance and capability were not diminished by the fact of where her parents were from, that Neville Longbottom, who struggled in the early years, was capable of genuine courage in the years that followed, that Harry Potter, whom the ideology said should not matter, mattered in the specific and concrete ways of someone who was actually there, and actually present, and actually doing things in the world. This observation did not constitute a change in his beliefs. He continued to hold and perform his beliefs across the whole 7 years. But the observation was in him, registered in the way that things are registered when you are forced into proximity with them for long enough that the ideology cannot prevent the registration. By the time he was on the tower with his arm shaking, and Dumbledore was saying he was not a killer, Part of what made the arm shake was 7 years of this accumulation. 7 years of the specific people that the ideology required him to devalue being consistently present in his daily life as genuinely real. He could not fire the curse at Dumbledore because Dumbledore was a specific person, and Draco was not capable of doing that to a specific person he had known for 6 years. The ideology did not run that deep. The specific, concrete, undeniable reality of the specific person ran deeper. This was what 7 years of living alongside actual human beings had done to the ideology. Not eliminated it, but undermined it at the level of specific people, leaving it intact as a general performance and hollow as a guide to action, when the action required him to treat a specific person as though they were what the ideology said they were. He was never going to follow through. He had been living, without knowing it, in conditions that ensured he would not be able to. The Hogwarts that his family had criticized for its values was the thing that had done this to him. Not through instruction, not through persuasion, simply through proximity, across 7 years, to the specific and undeniable reality of the people the ideology had said were not worth what he was. The night is quiet now. The story is complete. Rest.